She stood at a pawn counter holding a medal that had cost her blood, sweat, and 2 tours in a war zone, and she was selling it for grocery money. 3 months earlier, Dr. Victor Harlan had stood in front of hospital executives and told them Nurse Lena Marsh had let a patient die through negligence. He said it with a straight face, polished shoes, and a file folder full of evidence he had built himself. And they believed every word. What Harlan never counted on, a retired military war dog who had once dragged wounded soldiers out of burning vehicles, and who never forgot a cent. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now and follow this story all the way to the end, because the way this woman fights back is something you will not see coming. Drop a like on this video and tell me in the comments, what city or country are you watching from? I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let's get into it. Lena Marsh had not slept more than 3 hours at a stretch in 6 weeks. She knew this not because she was tracking it, but because every time she closed her eyes longer than that, she woke up sweating, her body convinced she was still in triage, still hearing the monitors, still smelling the antiseptic and copper, still trying to shout across a trauma bay that something was wrong. Then the ceiling of her studio apartment in Denton, Colorado would come into focus, water-stained and indifferent, and the silence would settle back in like a weight pressing on her sternum. The apartment was small enough that she could see the entire living space from the bed. A folding table with a laptop that no longer connected to the hospital system. A stack of papers. Formal letters from Ridgecrest Regional Medical Center's legal office. From the Colorado State Nursing Board. From the insurance provider that had terminated her malpractice coverage. A cardboard box near the door that had held her locker contents. A spare set of scrubs. A travel-sized first aid kit she'd packed out of habit. A photo of her unit from her second deployment, and the medal. The medal sat on top of everything else in the box. She hadn't moved it or touched it since the day she carried that box out through the hospital's service entrance because she couldn't bear to go out through the main lobby. A Bronze Star with Valor. The citation attached to it cited her actions during an emergency mass casualty event outside Kandahar in 2019, when she had kept 6 soldiers alive in the back of a vehicle with no proper equipment and a tourniquet she'd fashioned from a rifle sling. Nobody at Ridgecrest Regional had ever asked about it, not her supervisor, not the nursing board, not the executives who sat across from her in the termination meeting and listened to Dr. Victor Harlan describe her as someone who had shown a pattern of reckless disregard for physician authority and patient safety. She had sat through that meeting without crying, which had surprised her. She had cried during her deployment when her unit lost a 19-year-old corporal from Montana. She had cried at her grandmother's funeral. But in that boardroom, listening to Harlan speak about her as if she were a problem to be disposed of, she had felt nothing but a cold, clarifying fury. And underneath it, the slow realization that the fury wouldn't save her. The evidence they presented was damning. That was the word her public defender had used. Damning. A nursing board complaint filed by Dr. Harlan citing her failure to follow a physician directive during the resuscitation of a patient named Donald Fry. An incident report time-stamped at 11:47 p.m. that indicated Nurse Marsh had administered a vasopressor without attending physician approval, resulting in cardiac destabilization. Security footage from the trauma bay showing her at the medication cart during the time in question. A written statement from charge nurse Paulette Wade confirming that Dr. Harlan had issued clear verbal instructions that Lena had overridden. Every piece of it had her name on it. Every piece of it was wrong. She knew what had actually happened in Trauma Bay 2 that night. She had been there for every second of it, and she remembered it with the same precision she remembered every chaotic, high-stakes situation she had ever worked through. Not because she was exceptional, but because her brain had been trained for 6 years in conditions that demanded it. Donald Fry had presented with blunt abdominal trauma and falling pressure. His MAP had dropped to 52. Harlan had been present and had looked at the monitor and said, in the flat, distracted voice he used when he was annoyed at being called in, "Let's hold off on pressors and watch him." Lena had waited 40 seconds. She had watched the number drop to 48. She had said, "His pressure is still dropping, Dr. Harlan. He needs vasopressor support now." Harlan had said, "I heard you, Marsh. I said watch him." She had waited another 25 seconds. She had watched the number drop to 43 and seen the patient's skin go ashen. Then she had reached for the norepinephrine because she was looking at a man who was about to go into irreversible shock, and she had made a call that any competent trauma nurse with her experience would have made. Fry had stabilized. His pressure had climbed back to 68 within 4 minutes. Harlan had not said a word to her that night. He had documented his orders in the chart as having been ignored and walked out of the trauma bay at 12:03 a.m. She had not known what he was building until 2 weeks later, when the board meeting invitation arrived in her inbox with a subject line that read, "Urgent, Performance and Conduct Review." By then, the incident report had already been filed. The statement from Paulette Wade had already been collected. The security footage had already been reviewed by hospital administration. And according to the summary she was eventually shown, the footage showed her at the medication cart alone, without showing the full context of the preceding minutes when Harlan was present, when the monitor readings were visible, when Lena had twice verbally documented her concerns to the attending physician in a room with 2 other nurses. Those nurses, Tomas Reyes and Jocelyn Park, had been transferred to different departments before anyone asked them for statements. Lena had found that out from Tomas himself, in a parking lot conversation that lasted 4 minutes before he looked over his shoulder and said he couldn't talk about it and walked away. She had not heard from him since. She had not heard from most of her colleagues since. That was the thing nobody warned you about when your career collapsed under you. Not just the financial wreckage, not just the professional ruin, but the specific personal silence. The people who had eaten lunch with her, who had texted her memes about night shift struggles, who had stood next to her in trauma bays for 3 years, they went quiet. Not out of cruelty, necessarily, out of self-preservation. Nobody wanted to be adjacent to someone under board review. Paulette Wade had sent exactly one message. "I'm sorry, Lena. I didn't have a choice." Then nothing. She hadn't responded. She didn't know what she would have said. By the end of week 2 without income, Lena had sold her car and was relying on a borrowed bicycle in the bus schedule. By week 4, she had paid what she could on her rent and let the credit card go. By week 6, she was looking at the cardboard box near her door and calculating. The metal wouldn't bring much. She knew that. Military memorabilia had a market, but valor decorations were tricky. Buyers sometimes wanted provenance documentation that she didn't feel like providing because it meant explaining herself. Still, it was metal. It was real. And the electricity bill had a shut-off notice attached to it. She picked up the box and left. The shop was called Garrison Antiques and Collectibles, tucked between a tax preparation office and a dry cleaner on a stretch of Denton's older commercial strip that hadn't been renovated since the 90s. The sign in the window said military memorabilia / estate sales / fair prices, which Lena had learned through experience meant we will offer you less than half of what it's worth, and you will take it anyway because you need the money. The man behind the counter was heavy-set with thinning hair and reading glasses on a chain, and he looked at her metal for about 30 seconds before offering her $80. She talked him to $110, which she knew was still low, and she was standing at the counter holding the form he'd slid across to her when the door opened behind her. She didn't look up. She was focused on the line asking for her reason for sale, which she was going to leave blank. Then she heard a sound she hadn't heard in 3 years. A low, deliberate sound. Not a bark, not a whine, something between the two. The specific vocalization of a working dog encountering something that demanded its attention. The sound a trained animal made when its instincts activated. She turned. The dog was a German shepherd, older. She could see it in the gray around his muzzle and the careful way he held his back legs. But the eyes were completely alert, dark brown and fixed entirely on her. He was on a leash held by a tall man in his late 60s with white cropped hair, wearing a plain gray jacket over a collared shirt. The man was looking at a display case near the door, but the dog was not looking at anything except Lena. The shepherd stepped forward. The leash pulled taut. The man glanced down and then looked up, at her, at the counter, at what was sitting next to her hand on the glass surface. He stilled. Not the way people went still when they were startled. The way people went still when they recognized something. "Excuse me," he said. His voice was measured, not quite gentle, the voice of someone accustomed to being heard in large rooms. "Is that a bronze star with valor?" "It was," she said. He crossed to the counter in 5 steps. He looked at the medal without touching it. The shepherd moved with him, still watching her, and Lena found herself watching the dog back. That gray muzzle, those steady eyes, the slight quiver in his nose. "What branch?" the man asked. "Army, 68W Combat Medic, 2 tours." He looked up from the medal and looked at her directly. His eyes were gray and very clear. "Where was the second tour?" "Kandahar region, 2019 to 2020. Something shifted in his expression. Not dramatically. This was a man who controlled his face the way trained people did. But she saw it, a small tightening around the eyes. He looked back at the dog. The shepherd had sat down. That was the thing that struck her as strange. He hadn't been commanded to sit. He had simply sat. The way a well-trained dog sat when it had made a decision about something, and his eyes were still on her face with an attention that felt almost human. "His name is Bruno," the man said. "He worked K-9 search and rescue with the 10th Mountain Division. 3 deployments." He paused. "He doesn't usually do this with strangers." Lena looked at the dog more carefully, the gray muzzle, the shape of his ears, the way he sat, right hip slightly dropped, the careful posture of a working dog with old joint damage on his left rear quarter. The memory came in sideways, the way combat memories always did. Not linear, not narrative, but a cluster of sensation, dust and heat and the smell of diesel and blood. A vehicle on its side, soldiers in the dirt around it, and a dog, a young shepherd, panicked and limping, its handler down and unresponsive, Lena working on the handler and simultaneously trying to keep the dog from tearing itself apart in its distress, and finally looping her own belt around the dog's neck as a makeshift lead because somebody had to. "Bruno," she said, and the shepherd's ears came forward. "You were attached to a handler out of Fort Drum. You were in a vehicle rollover." She watched the dog. "Somebody used a belt on you because there wasn't anything else." The man was very quiet for a moment. "That was a 2019 incident," he said. "Sergeant First Class Dario Kwan's team." "Kwan had a chest injury. I worked on him for 23 minutes before the medevac arrived." She looked at the man. "I didn't know the dog's name. He was just the dog that needed to not run into traffic while I had my hands full." The man's expression had changed. He extended his hand. "General Theodore Wark," he said. "Retired, Army Medical Command." She shook his hand. "Lena Marsh, retired medic, currently unemployed." He looked at the medal on the counter. He looked at her. He looked at the form she had half filled out. "Would you like to tell me what happened?" She almost said no. The word was right there, the automatic deflection she had been using for 6 weeks with everyone who asked. Neighbors, her cousin in Wyoming, the unemployment caseworker who had clearly wanted to be somewhere else. "I'm fine. I'm handling it. I don't really want to get into it." But she was standing in a pawn shop about to sell the physical object that represented the worst and most important thing she had ever done. And the dog that she had looped a belt around in a ditch outside Kandahar was sitting 4 feet away, watching her with gray-muzzled patience. And Theodore Wark was looking at her with the particular expression of a man who had spent decades listening to people who needed to be heard. She said, "Do you have somewhere to be?" "Not particularly," he said. She left the medal on the counter. The shop owner had the grace to step into the back room, and she told Wark everything. Standing up, without notes, while Bruno sat between them and occasionally pressed his nose against her knee. She told him about Donald Fry and the falling MAP and the 40-second window she had waited. She told him about Harlan's tone in the trauma bay, the distracted dismissal of someone who considered a blood pressure reading an inconvenience to his schedule. She told him about the incident report that appeared 13 days later, the transfer of Tomas Reyes and Jocelyn Park, the statement from Paulette Wade. She told him about the board meeting, the documents spread on the table, the trimmed security footage, the phrase reckless disregard delivered in Harlan's smoothest register while she sat across from executives who had already made up their minds. Wark listened. He didn't interrupt. Bruno periodically nudged her hand with the top of his head, and she found herself scratching behind his ears without thinking about it, the way you did with animals that decided to trust you. When she finished, Wark said, "What did you keep?" "From the hospital." "What?" "When you left, what did you take with you?" She thought about it. My personal effects. Nothing from patient records? I knew better than to touch those. There was a storage drive I'd used for my nursing CE documentation. Training records, continuing education certificates. I brought it home, but it had a corrupted partition. I couldn't access most of it. What else? She thought harder. Some personal notes I kept in a small notebook. I didn't think they'd be relevant to anything. Notes from when? From the night Donald Fry came in. I write things down sometimes, during a shift, after a shift. It's a habit from deployment. You document what you see when you see it, because memory is unreliable under stress. What did you write down that night? Times, readings, what Harlan said, what I said, the exact sequence of what happened at the cart. She paused. I wrote the map readings as I observed them, with times. Work was quiet for a moment. Bruno had moved and was now sitting directly beside Lena with his flank pressed against her leg, which he had not been commanded to do. The incident report they filed, Work said. What time did it say you administered the vasopressor? 11:47 p.m. And in your notes? She remembered. She had written it down in the parking lot of the hospital before driving home, sitting in her car with a pocket notebook and a flashlight because her hands needed something to do. 11:49, and Harlan's verbal instruction to hold, I wrote that at 11:39. A 10-minute window between his instruction and your action. Yes. And the report says you acted immediately, without waiting. That's what it says. Work looked at Bruno, who was still pressed against Lena's leg with the calm steadiness of a much younger dog. The footage they reviewed, he said carefully. You said it showed you at the medication cart. Did it show Harlan? Administration said the relevant section of footage was, they used the phrase, degraded. Poor image quality from that camera angle. Degraded, he repeated, or edited. The word landed differently than she expected. She had thought it. She had lain in her apartment at 3 a.m. and thought it. But she had also told herself she was being paranoid, that it was easier to believe in conspiracy than to accept that a reasonable set of people had simply found her version of events less credible than Harlan's. That's a significant claim, she said. Yes, Work agreed. It is, which is why you need more than a notebook. He picked up the medal from the counter and turned it over once. I'm going to buy this back from you. You don't have to, I know I don't have to. I'm doing it because it belongs on a wall, not behind a display case. He put the medal in his jacket pocket and looked at the shop owner's back room. Let's go somewhere else to talk. There's a diner on 4th Street that I prefer. He looked at her. Bruno will need water. They know him there. She almost smiled. It was the first time the Muscles had attempted it in 6 weeks. You take your dog to a diner. He's earned it, Work said, which was completely serious and somehow also the funniest thing she had heard since this all started. The diner was called Mercer's, and it smelled like coffee and old vinyl, and the specific grease of a place that had been cooking the same breakfast menu since 1987. A woman behind the counter gave Bruno a water bowl without being asked, which suggested Work's claim that they knew him there was accurate. They took a corner booth. Work ordered coffee. Lena ordered coffee and a sandwich because she hadn't eaten since that morning and her body was making its displeasure known. Tell me about Harlan, Work said. What do you want to know? Whatever you've had 6 weeks to think about. What did he actually want from this? Lena had thought about this extensively. She had a theory that she'd never said out loud because out loud it sounded like exactly the kind of thing someone said when they were looking for someone to blame for their own failures. Donald Fry was the second patient in 8 months who presented with similar trauma and similar drops in pressure, she said. The first one, this was before my time on that rotation, had a worse outcome. He survived, but there were complications. Post-op infection, extended ICU stay. The family had filed a complaint through patient services. Nothing formal, just a complaint. But it was in the record. And Harlan had been the attending. And his management decisions on that case were defensible, probably, but they were borderline. He'd held off on intervention longer than most attendings would have. The patient had deteriorated to a point that complicated the recovery. Work was watching her with his gray eyes and his coffee cup untouched. I think, she said, That when Fry came in and I pushed back on the hold-off call, Harlan saw two things simultaneously. He saw a nurse questioning him in front of other staff, which he had never tolerated. And he saw a potential pattern, another borderline call, another patient who might deteriorate, another complaint in the file. She looked at her coffee. I think he decided that it was better to have the story be about a reckless nurse than about a surgeon with a pattern. And he had access to the documentation systems. He's a senior attending. He has significant access. And the charge nurse's statement, Paulette Wade has 2 kids in college, Lena said flatly. Harlan is on the quality assurance committee that reviews shift supervisor performance annually. I'm not saying she lied easily. I'm saying she was in a position where refusing to cooperate had a very clear cost. Work picked up his coffee finally and drank from it. I want to look at that storage drive, he said. It's corrupted, I told you. Corrupted doesn't mean empty. It means the index is damaged. He set the cup down. I know a man at the VA who does forensic data recovery for the JAG Corps. He's done it for 15 years. If there's anything recoverable on that drive, he'll find it. What would be on it? You said you used it for continuing education documentation. Right. Certificates, module completions, that sort of thing. What system did you access those through? The hospital's internal learning management portal. It synced automatically to... She stopped. Her brain had caught up to where he was going before she finished the sentence, and the sensation was like stepping through ice. Cold, sudden, disorienting. It synced automatically to the shift scheduling and documentation system, the same back-end that logged clinical activity. Or if your drive ever connected to that system and cached data automatically, it might have pulled metadata, timestamps, system logs. She was thinking fast now, the way she thought in a trauma bay, lateral and rapid and without self-censorship. If the cache preserved anything from that night, anything from the clinical system, there might be records that predate whatever was altered in Harlan's documentation. There might be, Work said. There might not be. But you have a drive that nobody knows you have, and a notebook that nobody knows you kept, and a pattern that once you start looking for it becomes visible. He paused. Who transferred your colleagues? The department head, Dr. Rachel Aldis. Is she Harlan's ally or his supervisor? Officially his supervisor, practically, Lena considered. She deferred to him on everything. He was her biggest revenue generator. He brought in complex cases, billing relationships, conference invitations. She protected him. So the transfer served 2 purposes, Work said, removing the witnesses and rewarding Harlan's loyalty to whatever arrangement they had. Or she was just afraid of him, Lena said. People were. He could make your professional life very complicated very quickly if you crossed him. Did he ever try that with you before the Fry incident? Lena thought about it honestly. The answer was yes, in the way these things always worked. Not dramatically, not overtly, but in the small, calibrated ways a powerful person reminded someone beneath them of the distance between them. A comment about her assessment in a busy hallway where it would be overheard. A chart note that questioned a decision she'd made without seeking her response first. Once at a department meeting, he had referred to her in front of 8 colleagues as the medic, rather than by name or title. Not cruelly enough to call out, precisely cruelly enough to land. He made it clear I was provisional, she said, that whatever I'd done before didn't translate into authority here. Did you push back? Every time I disagreed with a clinical call, yes. Not personally, not about his attitude, just about patient care. And that was enough, Work said quietly. Not a question. Lena looked out the window. On the street, a woman was walking a retriever and talking on her phone, and the dog was pulling toward a fire hydrant with absolute single-minded purpose. And the woman wasn't paying attention, and somehow that small mundane scene, the dog with its goal, the person distracted, the gap between them, struck her as exactly correct. He needed me to be wrong, she said, and when I wasn't wrong, he made me wrong. Bruno, under the table, had his head resting on her foot. She hadn't noticed when that had happened. Work reached into his jacket, not the same jacket pocket where the medal was, but an inside pocket, and produced a card. He slid it across the table. Plain white with a phone number and his name and 2 words beneath it. Army Medical Command, and then below that in smaller print, Office of the Inspector General, retired. I'm going to need to make some phone calls, he said. The forensic technician, A colleague at the state medical board who owes me a professional courtesy, and potentially someone at the hospital. He looked at her steadily. You're going to need to be willing to go back in. To Ridgecrest. Not as a nurse, not yet. But eventually, yes. With documentation, with support, and under different circumstances than you left. His voice was neutral, not soft. Can you do that? Lena picked up the card. She looked at it for a moment. The number was a 719 area code. Colorado Springs, which was where the Fort Carson complex was, which meant this man's retirement was theoretical at best. I need my license back, she said. That's what I need. I know. And I need Harlan's file to show what he actually did, not what I can prove he did, what he did. That too. Work didn't flinch from it. Those are both achievable. They're going to take time and they're going to require you to be patient when everything in you wants to move. I'm a combat medic, she said. I can hold a position. Something almost warm moved across Wark's expression. Not quite a smile. An acknowledgement. I know, he said. Under the table, Bruno shifted his weight and pressed more firmly against her foot. And outside the diner window on the ceiling of a strip mall pharmacy, a security camera Lena had not noticed was mounted at an angle that covered the entire stretch of 4th Street, including the parking area behind Mercer's Diner, where a gray sedan with Colorado plates that she hadn't seen before was idling just outside the range of the nearest streetlight, engine running, going nowhere. She didn't see it, but Bruno did. His head came up from her foot, his ears moved forward. He made no sound, just that subtle realignment of attention, the shift of a trained animal registering something that hadn't been there a minute ago. By the time Lena looked down at him, he was still again, watching the door. Bruno's ears stayed forward for 11 seconds. Lena counted without meaning to. It was a medic habit, the automatic calibration of time during moments that felt unstable. Then the dog's posture eased by a fraction, not fully, but enough that she could read it as a downgrade rather than a dismissal. Whatever had caught his attention hadn't moved closer. Wark had noticed. He was looking at Bruno the way a man looked at an instrument he trusted more than his own senses. We should go, he said. Not urgent. Matter of fact, the way a person said it when going was simply the correct next decision. Lena left money on the table without being asked. She didn't know why that felt important, but it did. Some instinct about not owing anything to a situation she didn't yet understand. She pulled on her jacket and followed Wark out through the side door, Bruno moving between them with the deliberate heel position of a dog that had been trained to place itself where it could cover both handlers at once. The parking area behind Mercer's was empty, except for Wark's truck, a dark green Ford with a Fort Carson visitor pass still clipped to the visor. The gray sedan she hadn't noticed earlier was gone. The space where it had idled was just asphalt, a faint oil mark, nothing. She almost said something about it. Then she decided not to, because she wasn't certain she had seen it, and she was not going to start making claims she couldn't verify. That was the thing Harlan had done to her, made assertions that were just credible enough to stick. She wasn't going to do the same thing to herself. Wark loaded Bruno into the back seat with the ease of long practice and looked at her across the roof of the truck. I'll need the drive and the notebook tomorrow. Can you bring them to me? Where? He gave her an address in the south part of Denton, a VA-affiliated office building near the base of the foothills. 9 a.m. Don't bring them anywhere else before then, and don't tell anyone you have them. I haven't told anyone anything for 6 weeks. I know, he said. That's the only reason they're still usable. She watched him drive away. Then she rode her bicycle home in the dark with the cold of a late Colorado October working through her jacket, and she thought about the gray sedan, and she thought about Paulette Wade's message. I didn't have a choice. And she thought about Tomas Reyes in the parking lot looking over his shoulder, and by the time she got back to her apartment, she had a very clear understanding that whatever had been done to her had not been done hastily. It had been planned. The sequence of it, the transfers, the statement, the trimmed footage, the incident report with its specific timestamp, that was not the work of a man who had panicked. That was the work of a man who had prepared. She pulled the corrupted drive from her desk drawer and held it. It was a standard USB drive, gray plastic, the size of a thumb. She had bought it 2 years ago at an office supply store. It had sat in her locker for months, accumulating sync data from the hospital's learning portal. She had never once thought about what else that sync might have pulled. She put it in the desk drawer again. She put her notebook on top of it. She did not sleep much, but when she did, Bruno's steady warmth against her foot was the last physical sensation she remembered, and for the first time in 6 weeks, the waking up didn't feel like surfacing from something terrible. The VA office building was 3 stories of concrete and tinted glass that had been built in the 80s and renovated twice without ever quite catching up to the present. The lobby had a reception desk staffed by a woman in her 50s who looked at Lena's ID, made a call, and waved her through with the specific disinterest of someone who had processed too many visitors to be curious about any of them. Work was on the 2nd floor in an office that looked like a storage room with ambitions. Filing cabinets on 2 walls, a folding table with 2 laptops on it, Bruno asleep on a padded mat in the corner with the immediate totality of a dog who had decided the day's work was done. A man Lena had not expected was standing at the folding table. He was younger than she would have guessed for someone Wark had described as having 15 years of forensic experience. Mid-40s, short, with the slightly distracted manner of a person whose primary relationship was with equipment rather than people. He introduced himself as Garrett Souza without extending his hand, because both hands were already holding a cable assembly he was in the process of untangling. "The drive," he said. She gave it to him. He took it without ceremony and plugged it into a device she didn't recognize, then into one of the laptops, and then stood looking at the screen with his head slightly tilted, the way people looked at things they were reading in a language they knew but had to work at. "Partition table's corrupted," he said. "Not destroyed. Somebody formatted it without a full wipe, which means the underlying sectors are mostly intact. This is going to take a few hours." "How many hours?" 3. Maybe 4. Depends on what's actually there. He glanced at her once, briefly. "What am I looking for?" Work answered for her. "Cached sync data from a hospital clinical documentation system. Specifically, anything timestamped between 11 p.m. and 1 a.m. on the night of September 14th. Souza nodded like this was a perfectly ordinary request, which for him it probably was. He turned back to the screen. Wark gestured to the 2 folding chairs near the window. "Sit down. Tell me about the first patient." Lena looked at him. "I told you about Donald Fry." "Not Fry. You mentioned there was a prior patient, 8 months before. Similar presentation, worse outcome. Who was he?" She hadn't given him that patient's name because she didn't know if she was allowed to, which was the reflexive concern of someone who'd had 3 years of HIPAA training. Then she thought about what Harlan had done with records and documentation and decided that her concern about privacy was approximately the least relevant thing in this room. "His name was Gerald Okafor," she said. 62 years old, blunt abdominal trauma from a vehicle accident. He came in 7 months before the Fry incident, before I was on that rotation. I only know about him because I saw the complaint letter in Harlan's file. Harlan left it open on his desk once, and I saw the name." She paused. "The family alleged delayed intervention. The complaint was reviewed and closed without action." "Who reviewed it?" "The Quality Assurance Committee, which Harlan sits on." "Which Harlan sits on," she confirmed. Wark had a legal pad and was writing on it with a mechanical pencil, which seemed anachronistic for a man who had clearly spent time in environments with better equipment, but which also seemed completely right for him. "When you were still employed at Ridgecrest, did you ever interact with the Okafor family?" "No, I didn't know them. I only connected the name to the complaint after I was fired, when I was going back through everything I remembered." "Did you document that connection anywhere?" "In my notebook." He made a note. "What else is in the notebook that isn't about the Fry incident?" She thought about it carefully, because the notebook was 7 months of shift observations, and she had not read it recently. "There are notes from about 3 weeks before the Fry incident where I documented a conversation with Harlan in a hallway. He told me, and I wrote it down because the phrasing struck me. He said, 'Your job is to implement, not evaluate.' I'd questioned a discharge timeline on a different patient." Wark looked up from his pad. "You wrote that down?" "At the time I wrote it down because I was irritated and I write when I'm irritated. Now I'm writing it down for different reasons." She looked at her hands. "I wasn't building a case. I was just keeping track. The distinction doesn't matter legally, Wark said. What matters is that you have a contemporaneous record that predates the incident and establishes a pattern of friction. That's significant. Significant enough for the state board? Significant enough to ask for a formal investigation, which is different from a board review. A board review evaluates whether you violated standards of practice. An investigation looks at whether the evidence against you was legitimate. She absorbed this. The distinction felt important in a way she couldn't immediately articulate. The difference between being judged and being listened to. Can you get that? She asked. An investigation? I can make a call to someone on the investigative oversight panel who will take it seriously. I can't promise an outcome. He put the pencil down. What I can promise is that the call gets made today, and that when it's made, I tell them that I have reason to believe material evidence in a nursing board proceeding may have been falsified. That's a large claim. Yes, and I need the drive to support it. He looked across at Sousa, who was mothing something at his screen that might have been a quiet word of either encouragement or frustration directed at the equipment. So we wait. They waited for 4 hours and 20 minutes, which Lena spent in the folding chair going through her notebook page by page with Wark, while he made more notes on his legal pad, and Bruno slept with the peaceful authority of a dog that had nothing to prove. She hadn't eaten breakfast. Around noon, Wark produced 2 granola bars from a desk drawer with the same lack of ceremony with which he seemed to do everything, and she ate hers without tasting it. Sousa broke the silence at 1:47 p.m. Got something, he said. Not excited, informational. They both stood. The screen showed a directory of recovered files, most of them fragmentary, partial certificates, corrupted headers, sync logs with gaps. But in the middle of the list, there was a folder labeled with a date string, 091423-RRMCCLS-sync, which Lena recognized as Ridgecrest Regional Medical Center Clinical Logging System, and the date was September 14th. The sync captured a portion of the clinical activity log from that shift, Sousa said. It's not complete. There are gaps where the cache was overwritten by subsequent activity. But the section between 11:31 p.m. and 12:04 a.m. has intact metadata. Lena's throat tightened. What's in it? Wark asked. Sousa scrolled. Physician login for Harlan at 11:33 p.m. Patient file access. There's a vital signs entry. I can read the value. MAP 54 at 11:36. A nursing note flagged at 11:38 by user ID ending in 2247. He looked at Lena. That's my ID, she said. The tightening in her throat had moved into her chest. The note text is partially recovered. It reads, Patient MAP declining, verbal notification to attending vasopressor. And then it cuts off. Sousa scrolled further. There's a second nursing note at 11:42, same user ID. Recovered text. MAP 43, patient showing signs of cut off again. Then a medication administration record at 11:49 p.m., norepinephrine, 0.1 micrograms per kilogram per minute. Same user ID. Lena exhaled. 11:49. Not 11:47. 2 minutes later than the incident report claimed, which was 2 minutes that contained a verbal exchange she had documented and Harlan had denied. What does the incident report say she administered? Wark asked. 11:47, Lena said. 2-minute discrepancy, Sousa said, which matches the nursing note timestamps. She documented the verbal notification at 11:38. If administration happened at 11:49, there's an 11-minute window between her notification and her action. And the incident report says she acted immediately, Wark said, without waiting for physician response. 11 minutes is not immediately, Sousa said, which was perhaps the most understated thing said in that room. Lena sat back down in the folding chair because her legs had made a decision without consulting her. She put her hands flat on her thighs and breathed once, deliberately. The data on that screen was not exoneration, not by itself, not yet, but it was a crack in a wall that had seemed solid for 6 weeks, and the sensation of it was almost physical, like pressure releasing. Is there anything else? Wark asked Sousa. Sousa scrolled to the bottom of the recovered directory. One more thing. There's a file access log for the hospital's documentation system. The log shows a file modification to Harlan's incident report entry, not the initial creation, a modification, time-stamped at 2:31 a.m. on September 15th. Work went very still. The incident is time-stamped 11:47 p.m., Lena said. He filed it that night. He filed something that night, Sousa said carefully, but the modification log shows the document was accessed and changed 3 hours later. At 2:31 a.m., user login for Harlan. He looked at Work. The final version is what the board saw, but the modification timestamp means there was an earlier version. Can you recover it? Work asked. No, the earlier version isn't on the drive. This is just the access log, proof the modification happened, not proof of what changed. He paused. But that log came from the hospital's own system. If someone subpoenas the hospital's server records, the earlier version would be in the backup, Work said. If the backup hasn't been purged, Sousa said. There was a silence in the room that felt like the held breath before something. How long do hospitals typically keep backup records? Work asked, and the question was directed at Lena because she would know. Ridgecrest's policy is 90 days for clinical system backups, she said. After that, they archive to off-site storage for 7 years. But active server backups, the kind that would have the document version history, those are 90 days and then they're overwritten. The incident was September 14th, Work said. It's October 28th, Lena said. 44 days, 46 days remaining in the 90-day window. Work was already reaching for his phone, says. The call he made was not to his contact at the state nursing board. He made that 1 second, brief and precise. The first call was to a number he dialed from memory, and when the other end picked up, he said without preamble, I need a legal preservation order on server backup records at Ridgecrest Regional Medical Center in Denton, Colorado, clinical documentation system. I need it filed before the end of business today. There was a response she couldn't hear. Yes, Work said. Today, not tomorrow. Another pause. I'm aware of what that takes. I'm asking anyway. He hung up and looked at Lena. If the order goes through, the hospital is legally required to halt any overwriting of those backups. The document version history gets frozen. And if it doesn't go through today, then we have 46 days to get it through another way. It was not a guarantee. She had stopped expecting guarantees 3 months ago, maybe longer, but it was movement, and movement was something. Sousa was copying files to a secure drive that he labeled with a marker and handed to Work without explanation. He was already disconnecting equipment when he looked up at Lena with the slightly unfocused attention of a man who had been staring at screens for 4 hours. There's one more thing I found, he said. It's probably not relevant, but I flagged it. Show me, Work said. Sousa pulled up a fragment, a partial sync log from a different date, October 3rd, 3 weeks after Lena had been terminated. This was in a residual cache. Your drive synced once more after you were let go. Probably an automatic connection when you were somewhere near the hospital's network. It pulled a fragment of activity log, 1 entry. He pointed at the screen. The log entry showed a file access for the Okafor patient record. The earlier patient, the one from 8 months before the Fry incident. The access was logged under Harlan's credentials. Date, October 3rd, 19 days after Lena had been fired. He was in the Okafor record 3 weeks after I was let go, Lena said. Looking at it or modifying it? Work asked Sousa. Can't tell from the fragment, just that it was accessed. Lena looked at Work. He looked at her. Neither of them said what they were both thinking, because saying it in this room without more evidence was speculation. But the thought was there, clear and cold. Harlan hadn't finished with his documentation work when he filed the incident report. He was still tending it, still managing the record, still making sure that if anyone looked back further than September 14th, what they found would hold. He wasn't just protecting himself from what Lena knew. He was building a wall around everything that came before her. Bruno was awake now, sitting upright on his mat with his ears forward. He had made no sound during the entire 4 hours, But Lena had noticed him watching the door twice, the same precise attention he had turned toward the parking area behind the diner the previous night. She had noticed it and filed it and not asked Wark about it because she had enough to process. She asked now, "Does he do that, the door thing?" Wark glanced at Bruno and then at the door without changing expression. "When something is off, yes." "Is something off?" "We've been in this building for 4.5 hours, Wark said, and we came from a diner where a vehicle with no visible occupant was idling in the lot for 20 minutes. He said it the way he said everything, factually, without alarm, as if the information were simply data to be processed and not a reason to panic. "Probably nothing. Possibly someone at the hospital was more worried about you than they let on." "Or someone was worried about you," Lena said. Wark considered this with equal neutrality. Also possible. "You said Harlan has connections. You meant that broadly." "I meant that a man who sits on a quality assurance committee and has been at that hospital for 11 years has a network. Networks have perimeters." He looked at Bruno once more, then stood and began putting on his jacket. "We're not coming back here tomorrow. I'll contact you through a different channel." She wanted to ask what channel, but he was already moving and it was clear this was not a request for more discussion. She gathered her notebook. Sousa had photographed every page on a scanner before returning it, and followed Wark into the hallway. In the elevator, Bruno pressed against her left side in the same way he'd pressed against her in the diner booth. She looked down at him. He looked up at her with those steady brown eyes and the gray-muzzled patience that had, over the past 24 hours, started to feel less like a dog's tolerance and more like a specific form of solidarity. "How long did he work?" she asked, meaning deployments, active duty. The years before Wark's retirement had taken them both out of the field. 8 years, Wark said. 3 deployments. He was injured on the 3rd one. Shrapnel, left rear quarter. You saw the hip. I saw the hip. He was supposed to be retired to a private home, standard transition for working dogs past their service window. Wark looked at Bruno with the specific expression of a man who had lost arguments before and knew when to stop relitigating them. He wouldn't settle. Kept reverting to work behaviors, alerting on things that weren't threats, not sleeping through the night. A pause. So I kept him. Because the work was all he knew. Because the work was all either of us knew, Wark said, and the elevator opened into the lobby. Outside, the afternoon had gone gray with incoming clouds, the kind of flat October light that made Denton look older than it was. Wark's truck was still in the lot, undisturbed, no gray sedan, nothing in the row of parked cars that looked out of place. He handed her a prepaid phone, still in its packaging, from his jacket pocket. "My number is already in it. Use this for contact, not your personal phone." She took it. She almost asked why. And then she thought about the gray sedan and Sousa's flagged entry and Harlan accessing the Okafor record 19 days after she'd been fired. She thought about a man who had planned each step carefully enough to manufacture an evidence trail in a system he had access to. A man like that did not stop planning when the primary threat had been neutralized. He started looking for secondary ones. "Wark," she said. He stopped with his hand on the truck door. "The preservation order. If it goes through—" She paused, making sure she was asking the right question. "Is it possible that someone at the hospital gets notified when a legal hold is placed on their records?" He looked at her for a moment. "Yes," he said. "The hospital's legal office would be notified. And Harlan would know someone at the hospital's legal office. He would. So if the order goes through today, he'll know by tonight that someone is looking," Wark said. Lena nodded slowly. The math of it was not reassuring. A legal hold meant protection for the evidence. It also meant that whoever had been managing that evidence would know the window was closing. A man who had modified an incident report at 2:31 in the morning and accessed a prior patient's record 3 weeks after he'd solved his immediate problem was not a man who would go quietly into the discovery process. Wark seemed to arrive at the same calculation at the same moment, because he said, "Don't go home tonight." She blinked. "What?" "Not your apartment. Go somewhere else, someone you trust." He met her eyes steadily. "I'm not predicting anything specific, but if Harlan gets notification tonight that a legal hold has been placed on Ridgecrest servers, and he connects that to you, and he has someone who's been watching, you're telling me to disappear for a night." I'm telling you that the evidence we found today is recoverable because you kept a drive nobody knew you had. I'd like it to stay that way." He got in the truck. Bruno was already in the back seat, ears still forward, watching the lot. "Call me on that phone when you're settled somewhere. Don't tell me the address in a message. Call." She stood in the parking lot after he pulled out and thought about who she trusted in Denton. The list was short. It had been short before all of this, and it was shorter now. She thought of her cousin in Wyoming, who was too far. She thought of Tomas Reyes, who had walked away from her in a parking lot and hadn't looked back. She thought of Jocelyn Park, who had been transferred to the ICU and whom she hadn't contacted because she was afraid of contaminating whatever testimony Jocelyn might still be willing to give. Then she thought of someone she hadn't thought of in months. A woman named Adrienne Tully, who had been a paramedic supervisor at Denton EMS and who had done 2 years in the Army Reserve and who had, on Lena's first week at Ridgecrest, appeared in the ER bay with a trauma patient and said, upon being introduced to the new nurse, "You smell like you actually know what a tourniquet is for. Good." They had been something adjacent to friends. Not close, not regularly in contact, but the kind of people who would answer if the other called. Lena pulled out the prepaid phone and called Wark's number to make sure it worked. It did. Then she put it in her pocket and got on her bicycle. She was 3 blocks from the VA building when she noticed the car. Not gray this time. Blue. A dark blue domestic sedan with a cracked left taillight moving at a consistent distance behind her that was not consistent with traffic. She turned right at an intersection without signaling. The blue car turned right 30 seconds later. She turned left. The car adjusted. She sped up. The car maintained its distance. Not closing, not falling back, just maintaining. She kept her breathing even. She thought about the exit from her current position. Storefronts on one side, a residential block on the other, a public library 2 blocks north. She turned north. The car followed. The library had a parking lot with 2 entrances. She rode into the lot through the east entrance, ditched her bike at the rack near the front door, and went inside without looking back. The library was warm and fluorescent and smelled like carpet cleaner and old paper. She went to the reference section in the back, found a chair between 2 shelves, and sat with a line of sight to the front entrance. She called Wark on the prepaid phone. He picked up on the second ring. She told him about the blue car in 11 words, the color, the cracked taillight, the east entrance turn pattern. There was a brief silence. Then Wark said, "Stay in the library. I'm 20 minutes out." "You don't need to." "I know I don't need to," he said, which was the same thing he'd said about buying the medal back, and she stopped arguing. She sat in the reference section with her notebook in her lap and watched the front entrance and thought about the modification timestamp, 2:31 a.m., and the Okafor record accessed 3 weeks after she was fired, and the gray sedan outside the diner, and the careful sequence of everything that had been done to her. It had not been done by a man who panicked. It was being maintained by a man who was still watching, and somewhere in Ridgecrest Regional Medical Center, Victor Harlan was about to find out that someone had placed a legal hold on the records he thought he had already buried. Wark arrived in 19 minutes, not 20. Lena saw the green truck pull into the library lot through the window between 2 shelves of reference encyclopedias, and she watched him get out without hurrying, scan the lot once with the unhurried sweep of someone who had done it 10,000 times, and come inside. Bruno was not with him, which meant he had gone somewhere first, or was leaving the dog somewhere safe, or had decided a library was not the right environment for a German Shepherd with alert ears and a tendency to make decisions. He found her in the reference section without asking anyone. She had not told him where in the library she was. "The blue car," he said, sitting in the chair beside her without preamble. "It's gone. I came in from the north end of the block. Nothing matching that description in the surrounding streets. They saw me come in and left. Or they were satisfying themselves that you were contained and reported back. To who? That's the question we need to answer before tomorrow morning." He put his forearms on his knees and looked at the carpet. It was the posture of a man thinking, not a man defeated, and she had learned in 24 hours to read the difference. The preservation order went through, filed at 4:52 p.m., Ridgecrest's legal office was notified at 5:08. It was 5:41 now. So he knows, she said. Harlan or someone in his orbit knows that a legal hold has been placed on clinical documentation records from September 14th. Wark looked up. That's specific enough to tell him exactly what we found. He knows the drive exists. He doesn't know what's on it yet, but he knows enough to understand that the version history of that incident report is now frozen. Lena thought about this with the part of her brain that had been trained to assess damage quickly and prioritize. If the document was modified at 2:31 a.m. and the earlier version is in the backup, then what's in the earlier version is the thing he can't afford for anyone to see. Yes. Which means the earlier version either doesn't name me or names someone else, or describes the sequence of events in a way that's incompatible with the final report. Or all three, Wark said. We won't know until the server records are subpoenaed. I have a JAG attorney who's filing the subpoena request tomorrow morning, which means we'll have a hearing date within 72 hours. And between now and then? Between now and then, Harlan has a window. He can't alter the backup without triggering a separate federal tampering charge, because the legal hold has a digital audit trail, but he can work his network. He can pressure witnesses. He can contact the nursing board and argue that the investigation request is retaliatory. Wark's voice stayed level throughout all of this, which Lena found simultaneously steadying and slightly maddening because she was not feeling level. He can also decide that the most efficient solution is to discredit the source of the subpoena before it's heard. Which is you. Which is me, and by extension, you. She looked at the front entrance of the library. A woman with 2 children was returning books at the desk. An elderly man was sitting with a newspaper 3 rows over. Everything was ordinary in the way only public spaces could be. The deliberate ordinarianism of a place that existed to be accessible and therefore couldn't afford to feel threatening. I need to talk to Jocelyn Park, Lena said. Wark looked at her. She was in the trauma bay that night, not just near it. She was at the secondary cart when I administered the norepinephrine. She saw the monitor readings. She heard Harlan's directive, and she heard me push back. Lena paused. She was transferred to the ICU before anyone asked her for a statement. Why didn't you mention her before? Because I was afraid of contaminating her testimony. If she was going to be a witness, I didn't want it to look like I'd been coaching her. She met his eyes. But the subpoena changes things. If the board's investigator contacts her before I do, the first narrative she hears about what's happening will be whatever story Harlan's network is running right now. Wark was quiet for 3 seconds. She had noticed he did this, not hesitated, but counted, like a man who had learned to put a beat between stimulus and response because the response mattered. Do you have her contact information? Her personal cell from before? Call her tonight. Don't explain everything. Just ask if she's willing to talk. He stood. I'm going to take you to Adrienne Tully's, Bob. Don't look surprised. You mentioned her to me yesterday, and I looked into her. She's credible, and she's not connected to Ridgecrest. You'll be safer there than in your apartment. He didn't frame this as a question. Lena almost pointed out that she was a grown adult who had survived 2 combat deployments and could make decisions about where she slept. Then she thought about the blue car with the cracked taillight and said, Fine. Adrienne Tully lived in a narrow house on a residential street in North Denton with a pickup truck in the driveway and a porch light that came on automatically at dusk. She answered the door in cargo pants and a fleece pullover and looked at Lena for exactly 1 second before stepping aside to let her in, which was the thing about Adrienne. She processed fast and she didn't require lengthy explanation. You look terrible, she said, which was friendly in the way paramedics were friendly. I've had a rough 6 weeks. I heard something happened at Ridgecrest. Figured you'd call when you were ready. She looked at Wark, who had walked Lena to the door and was now standing on the porch with the patient stillness of a man comfortable with being assessed. Your Army. Retired, Wark said. Still Army, Adrienne said, and then to Lena. Your people? My people, Lena confirmed, which was not entirely accurate but was accurate enough. Adrienne let Wark in too, without being asked, and made coffee without asking if they wanted it, and sat across from them at a kitchen table with a scarred surface and said, Tell me what you need. Lena told her the condensed version. 15 minutes, no editorializing, the facts in sequence. Adrienne listened the way good paramedics listened, which was without expression but with total attention. And when Lena finished, she said, "Foki, the blue car. You get a plate?" "Partial, Colorado." First three characters were H7R. Adrienne looked at Wark. "You running that?" "I have someone on it," he said. "Good." She refilled her own coffee without offering more to them, which Lena recognized as a sign of comfort rather than rudeness. "You can have the back room. It locks from the inside." To Wark. "You staying?" "No, I have things to handle tonight." He looked at Lena. "Call Park. Then sleep if you can." He said it as if sleeping were a tactical directive, which for him it probably was. After he left, Adrienne sat with Lena for another hour at the kitchen table. She didn't ask for more details. She talked about a bad call she'd run that week, a residential fire, a family displaced. And Lena talked about the diner and Bruno pressing his head against her knee. And somewhere in the middle of it, the tension in Lena's shoulders dropped by a fraction, which was the most it had dropped in 6 weeks. She called Jocelyn Park at 9:15 p.m. Park picked up on the fourth ring with the voice of someone who had been awake but not expecting the call. There was a pause after Lena said her name, a pause that lasted long enough to mean something. "Lena," Jocelyn said finally, "I know this is unexpected. I just need to know one thing." She kept her voice even. "Are you willing to talk to me?" Another pause, then, "They told us not to contact you." "I know, I'm not asking you to violate anything. I'm asking if you're willing to talk." Silence on the line. Lena heard the sound of a door closing in the background, the specific sound of someone moving to a room where they wouldn't be overheard. "There's going to be an investigation," Jocelyn said quietly. "Not a board review, an actual investigation. Someone filed a subpoena today." "I know." "Is that you?" "It's people working with me." Jocelyn's breath was audible for a moment. "I've been waiting for someone to call," she said. "I didn't think it would be you directly." A long exhale. "They transferred me 6 days after the incident. Aldous told me it was a staffing reallocation. But Tomas was transferred the same week to a different department, and he'd been requesting that transfer for 2 years and been denied twice." Her voice was controlled but tight. The voice of someone who had been keeping something compressed for a long time. "I knew what it was. I just didn't know what to do about it." "Did anyone ask you for a statement?" "No, that was the thing. Nobody asked. Paulette gave a statement. I never understood why they didn't come to me or Tomas." Lena understood. Paulette Wade could be leveraged. Jocelyn Park and Tomas Reyes had been witnesses to the part of the timeline that destroyed Harlan's version of events, which meant the safest move was to remove them from proximity before the investigation required their statements. "If someone from the State Board's investigative office contacts you," Lena said carefully, "will you tell them what you saw?" Jocelyn was quiet again. Lena waited. "Yes," she said. "I'll tell them what I saw. I should have done something sooner, and I didn't, and—" She stopped. "Yes, tell whoever it is to contact me." Lena gave her Wark's number and hung up. She sat in the back room of Adrienne's house with her notebook on her knees and the prepaid phone on the bedside table, and she did not sleep for a long time. But when she did, it was without the 3 a.m. wake-up, and in the morning she felt something she had not felt in 6 weeks. She felt like the ground was solid under her feet. Polta. The hearing for the subpoena was set for 10 a.m. 3 days later in a state administrative building in Denver, and it lasted 45 minutes, and by the end of it, the backup server records at Ridgecrest Regional Medical Center were under court order to be preserved and produced within 5 business days. Wark had attended in a suit which looked both correct and slightly incongruous on him, like a tool being used for a purpose adjacent to its design. The JAG attorney he'd brought was a woman named Sylvie Oram, who was 42 years old and had the specific sharpness of someone who had spent 2 decades making arguments in rooms that didn't want to hear them. She presented the modification timestamp, the cached nursing notes from Lena's drive, and Wark's documentation of the timeline discrepancy in 22 minutes, without raising her voice once. The hospital's legal representative asked for a continuance. Oram opposed it. The magistrate denied the continuance. Lena sat in the gallery and watched and felt the strangeness of being in a room where people were fighting over the record of the worst night of her professional life, and the record was winning. That evening, Wark told her something she had not anticipated. They were in his office at the VA building, different floor than before, a deliberate change. And Bruno was awake and attentive in his corner, and Wark put a printed document on the table and said, Gerald Okafor's family filed a formal complaint against Ridgecrest Regional Medical Center in 2022. It was reviewed and closed by the hospital's Quality Assurance Committee within 60 days. I knew that, she said. What you didn't know is that the family retained an attorney 2 months ago and filed a renewed complaint with the state health department, citing new information. He looked at her. The new information is a deposition from a former Ridgecrest surgical tech who stated that Dr. Harlan's intervention on Gerald Okafor was delayed by approximately 18 minutes beyond what clinical indicators warranted, and that the attending record had been modified to compress the timeline. The air in the room shifted. The same thing, Lena said. The same mechanism, different patient, different year. Wark's voice was steady, but there was something beneath it. Not anger, but the quality of a man who had seen this particular pattern before and found it consistently unacceptable. The Okafor complaint and your subpoena are now going to land on the same desk at the state health department within the same week. Sylvie Oram is making sure of that. Lena stared at the document. Gerald Okafor's name in clean print at the top. 62 years old. Vehicle accident. Delayed intervention. A family who had filed a complaint and been managed back into silence by a committee that Harlan sat on. He did it twice, she said. At least twice. At least, Wark said. And when he needed someone to absorb the risk of the second one, he had already identified you as the most credible threat to his version of events, Wark said. A nurse who documented her assessments, who pushed back on clinical calls, who had military training that made her testimony unusually precise. If you ever decided to report him formally, your word against his was a problem. But your word against his in the context of a pending malpractice complaint. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. She had not been collateral damage. She had been selected. The thought settled into her with a strange, cold clarity. Not new rage. The rage had been there from the beginning. She'd just been running it on a low setting to preserve capacity. But a new shape to the thing. A specificity. She had walked into that trauma bay on September 14th with no idea that someone had been watching her long enough to understand exactly what kind of witness she would make and how to preempt her. Bruno crossed the room without being called and sat beside her chair. She put her hand on his head without looking down. What happens next? She said. The server records are produced within 5 business days. Oram reviews the document version history. If the earlier version of the incident report says what we think it says, it goes to the board. It goes to the board, the state health department, and potentially to the DA's office, because falsifying a medical record in connection with a patient harm event crosses from administrative into criminal. He paused. There will be a formal interview process. You'll be asked to give a recorded statement. Jocelyn Park will be asked. Tomas Reyes has already indicated to Oram's office that he's willing to speak. Tomas? She stopped. When? He called Oram's office yesterday morning. Apparently he's been wanting to for weeks. Wark's expression didn't shift. People wait until they believe the door is real before they walk through it. She exhaled. It came out uneven in a way she hadn't intended, and she pressed her lips together because she was not going to fall apart in this office. Not after 6 weeks of holding herself together with the particular stubbornness of someone who had been taught that composure in a crisis was not optional. Bruno pressed harder against her leg. There's one more thing, Wark said. She looked up. Harlan filed a counter-complaint with the nursing board yesterday. He's alleging that the subpoena request is retaliatory and that you're using military contacts to pressure hospital administration. He slid a second document across the table. He's requesting that your license suspension be extended pending investigation of the counter-complaint. She picked up the document. She read it. Her name appeared 4 times in the first paragraph, and each time it was attached to a phrase. History of insubordination, pattern of undermining physician authority, risk to patient safety, that she had heard before in different combinations, like a man working from a limited vocabulary of destruction. "He's panicking," she said. "Yes. This is noise. He's trying to clog the process." "He is, and it will add time. The board has to respond to every counter-complaint regardless of merit." But Oram anticipated this. She filed a motion to consolidate all proceedings under the State Health Department investigation, which means the counter-complaint gets reviewed in the same process that's already examining his documentation practices. So he filed a complaint that lands in the same investigation he's already under. "He may not have had good legal advice," Wark said. "Or he had good legal advice and didn't take it, which is its own category of problem." It was almost, not quite, but almost, something she might have found funny under other circumstances. A surgeon who had spent 11 years in a hospital controlling information, controlling people, controlling outcomes, now generating documentation that walked directly into the inquiry that would end him. She put the counter-complaint back on the table. "When do the server records arrive?" she said. 5 business days from today. Earliest is Monday. And the formal interview?" "Oram wants you in her office Thursday, with the notebook, the drive, and anything else you've retained." He looked at her. "How are you holding up?" The question surprised her coming from him, not because it was inappropriate, but because in 3 days of working with him, she had grown accustomed to the operational register, the information exchange, the forward momentum. The human question in the middle of it landed differently. "I'm fine," she said, which was automatic. He looked at her with the gray-eyed patience of a man who had heard "I'm fine" from soldiers who were not fine many more times than she had said it. "Adequately," she amended. "I'm functioning adequately." "That's more accurate," he said, which was not unkind. The server records arrived at Oram's office on the following Monday at 3:17 p.m. in an encrypted file transfer that required 3 passwords to open and came with a chain of custody document 14 pages long. Oram's paralegal spent 2 hours building the document index. Oram herself spent 4 hours in the version history of the incident report that Victor Harlan had filed at 11:47 p.m. on September 14th and modified at 2:31 a.m. on September 15th. Lena was in the waiting room outside Oram's office when the door opened and Oram stood in the frame with her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and said, in the flat tone of a person reporting data, "The original version of the incident report does not mention your name." Lena stood. "The original version," Oram continued, "names a medication error as a contributing factor in the patient's cardiac event, but attributes it to unclear verbal communication between attending and nursing staff during a high-acuity resuscitation, which is a finding that would result in a systems review, not a personnel complaint." She pulled her glasses down. "Harlan's name does not appear in the original as the responsible attending. It lists the attending as unknown pending review." Lena's mouth was dry. "He removed himself from the original and inserted you. The modified version names you specifically as having administered a vasopressor contra to direct physician instruction." Oram's voice was professionally neutral. "In the 3 hours between filing and modification, the incident transformed from a documentation problem into a personnel complaint with a named individual. Can you prove the modification was deliberate?" "The audit log shows his login credentials were used for the modification. The system captured his access token, and the edits are tracked at the field level. We can show exactly which words were changed, what was removed, and what was added." She looked at Lena over her glasses. "In 11 years of practice, I have not seen a cleaner piece of evidence of intentional record falsification." The waiting room was silent except for the ventilation system and the distant sound of traffic from the street below. "What happens now?" Lena said. "I'm filing the full evidence package with the State Health Department investigator tomorrow morning. Simultaneously, I'm requesting an emergency stay on the nursing board proceedings, which stops the counter-complaint in its tracks pending the health department's findings." Oram pulled her glasses off entirely and held them. "The health department has the authority to refer the matter to the DA's office for criminal charges. Given the Okafor connection and the documented pattern, I believe they'll use it." She let this land. She needed it to land. "And my license," she said. The stay request includes a provision for immediate reinstatement pending the investigation's outcome. The board will almost certainly grant it once they see what the health department has. Oram paused. Almost certainly is not certainly, but I'd put it at 90%. 90% was not a guarantee. 6 weeks ago, she would have taken 90% and been grateful without qualification. Now she took it and felt the remaining 10% like a cold thread. I need to be in that hospital, she said. I'm not saying I want to go back to Ridgecrest. I mean, I need to be able to work. I need to be in a clinical environment. Sitting in apartments and library reference sections is... She stopped. I understand, Oram said, and she said it the way people said it when they actually did. Lena went back to Adrienne's house that night and sat at the kitchen table and did not tell Adrienne everything, because some of it was still under the protective umbrella of legal process, and she was learning to be careful about what she put in conversation. But she told her enough, and Adrienne listened in the same way she had the first night, with the uncomplicated steadiness of a person who had sat with people in the worst moments of their lives and knew that most of what was needed was simply to stay. Bruno was there. Wark had brought him by an hour earlier, something about the office needing to be cleared, and the dog had investigated Adrienne's kitchen with professional thoroughness and then settled on his mat near the back door as if he had always been there. At 11:23 p.m., Lena's prepaid phone rang. Wark. She picked up. What? Harlan requested an emergency meeting with the hospital's board of directors this afternoon. Aldous attended. The hospital's legal counsel attended. His voice was measured, but there was something in it, a tightening, that she had not heard before. The meeting lasted 2 hours. At the end of it, the hospital submitted a supplementary response to the health department's investigation request. What kind of supplementary response? They're contesting the validity of the cached drive data on the grounds that it was obtained outside of authorized hospital property and may represent unauthorized access to clinical systems. He paused. They're arguing that the evidence we built the subpoena on was collected illegally. She stood up from the table. Adrienne looked at her. The drive is mine, Lena said, and she heard the edge in her own voice. It's a personal drive I owned and used for my own CE documentation. The sync was automatic. I know that, Oram knows that, but this argument is designed to take time, and time is what Harlan needs right now. A beat. There's more. The hospital's supplementary response includes a statement from Dr. Rachel Aldous alleging that you approached a current Ridgecrest employee during the investigation period in an attempt to solicit testimony. I called Jocelyn Park on her personal phone. Aldous is framing it as witness tampering. The silence that followed was very loud. Bruno had lifted his head from the mat. He was looking at her. Sylvie Oram needs to know about this tonight, Lena said. I've already sent her the documents. She's reading them now. Wark's voice stayed level. This is Harlan's wall. He can see the case coming, and he's building obstruction as fast as he can. The question is whether he builds it faster than Oram can dismantle it. And if he does? There was a pause on the line that lasted long enough to be its own answer. Then we go to the backup, Wark said. What backup? The Okafor family's attorney filed a deposition request with the surgical tech 2 weeks ago. The tech agreed to testify. He paused. Her name is Nora Vasquez. She worked at Ridgecrest for 6 years. She left 8 months ago. Another pause. She left 8 months ago, which is approximately 1 month after the Okafor family complaint was reopened. Lena calculated. She left after the complaint was filed, not before. Correct. Which means she was still there when Harlan accessed the Okafor record 3 weeks after he fired me. Correct. She stood very still. Bruno was still watching her. Adrienne had moved to the kitchen doorway and was leaning against the frame with her arms crossed, reading the room the way a paramedic read a scene. She saw something, Lena said. She says she saw Harlan in the records office, Wark said. Late, alone, with access to a terminal that should have required dual authorization. When? October 3rd. The date hit her like a step off a curb she hadn't seen. October 3rd. The date the access log had shown on Sousa's recovery screen. The date Harlan had been in the Okafor record. The date that had been a fragment, a residual cache on a corrupted drive that nobody was supposed to know she had. She can place him there, Lena said, physically, at the terminal. She can place him there, Wark confirmed, and her deposition is already on record, filed under the Okafor civil matter, which means it exists independently of anything Harlan can now contest about the drive. Outside, the night was very quiet. Somewhere on the street, a car passed with its headlights washing briefly across the kitchen window. He doesn't know about Vasquez, Lena said. He doesn't know that Vasquez's deposition connects to the October 3rd access log. He doesn't know we have a witness who can corroborate the exact date and location of his record modification. Wark's voice had something in it now that she recognized. Not satisfaction, but the very specific register of a man who had been in enough long engagements to know the difference between a setback and a loss. His obstruction argument just bought him time he doesn't have enough of. Lena looked at Bruno. The dog had put his head back down, which was the closest thing to a verdict she was going to get from him tonight. Then her phone gave a second notification. Not Wark, a text from an unknown number that the prepaid phone had no reason to receive. And when she opened it, it contained 4 words and a Ridgecrest email address she recognized. We need to talk. The address belonged to Paulette Wade. Lena stared at the 4 words on the screen for long enough that Adrienne crossed the kitchen and looked over her shoulder. Who's Paulette Wade? Adrienne asked. The charge nurse who gave the statement against me. Adrienne was quiet for a moment. You going to respond? Lena was already typing Wark's number. He picked up before she finished explaining. Don't respond yet, he said, not until I find out how she got that number. The number is prepaid, it's 3 days old, which means either she has someone at a carrier level who ran the activation, or she got it from someone who already has it. His voice was precise. Who has that number besides me? Orem, Souza, Adrienne. I'll call Orem. He called back in 6 minutes. Orem's office didn't give it out. She's checking her paralegal. A pause. Souza is clean. He doesn't have it written anywhere accessible, which leaves one possibility. Someone is watching my contacts, Lena said, or Wade has more resources than a charge nurse should have access to. He said it carefully, the way he said things when he was revising his model in real time. She may not be acting alone in reaching out to you, meaning Harlan sent her. Or she's breaking from Harlan and using whatever she has available to reach you, and what she has available is not her own resources. A beat. Either way, you need to know which one it is before you say a word to her. Lena sat down at the kitchen table. Adrienne put a glass of water in front of her without comment, which was exactly the right thing to do. If Harlan sent her, Lena said, it's an attempt to get me on record saying something that can be used against the case. Witness tampering from my side. Evidence of coordination. She thought it through. If she's breaking from him, she has something she wants to trade. And she reached out on a number she shouldn't have, which means she's either desperate or she's being directed by someone who wanted the contact to be traceable back to you. Set me up as the one who initiated contact. It's possible, Wark said. It's also possible she's a frightened woman who gave a statement she regrets and is looking for a way out before the investigation reaches her. Lena thought about Paulette's message from 6 weeks ago. I didn't have a choice. Not, I'm sorry I lied. Not I told the truth. Just, I didn't have a choice. Which was a statement about circumstances, not about content, which had always bothered her in a way she hadn't fully articulated. She didn't say in her statement that she heard me override Harlan's order, Lena said slowly. What? I've read the statement 4 times. She said she was present when Dr. Harlan issued a clinical directive and that nursing staff did not comply with the directive. She didn't say she personally witnessed me administer the medication. She didn't say she saw me override anything specifically. She pressed her fingers against her temple. Her statement is, it's constructed to support the conclusion without making a direct claim she'd have to defend under cross-examination. Wark was silent for 3 seconds. She gave them the frame without the picture, which means she knows what she actually saw, and what she actually saw wasn't what the statement implies. Call her, Wark said. On that phone. Record it. Colorado is a one-party consent state, and stay on factual ground. Don't discuss the case. Just let her talk. What do I say when I call? Say you got her message. Say you're willing to listen. A pause. And Lena, if she starts to cry, don't let it move you faster than the information does. It was not unkind advice. It was accurate advice. She called Paulette Wade at 11:51 p.m. Wade picked up on the first ring, which meant she had been holding the phone. "Thank you," Wade said immediately, and her voice was tight in the way voices got when someone had been holding a specific tension for a long time. "I didn't know if you'd call." "I'm listening," Lena said. She kept her voice neutral, not warm, not cold, a breath on the line. "I need you to understand that when I gave that statement, they told me it was a quality review. They said it was standard procedure after a patient event. Aldis called me into her office, and there was already a document on the table, and she said she needed me to confirm that Dr. Harlan had issued a directive during the Fry resuscitation." "And you confirmed it." "I confirmed that he had spoken during the resuscitation, that he'd said something about the treatment approach." "That's what I said." Another tight breath. "I didn't say you'd refused a direct order. I didn't say that." "I know what you said," Lena replied. "I've read it." "Then you know I didn't—" She stopped. "They used it to say something I didn't say. And then it was in the record, and it was attributed to me, and I didn't know how to—" Her voice fractured at the edge. "I have 2 kids, Lena." "I know. That doesn't make it right." "I know it doesn't make it right." "No," Lena said. "It doesn't." She kept her voice even, not punishing, not forgiving, just present. "What do you want to tell me, Paulette?" A long pause. "After you were let go, Harlan came to me, in person. He told me that the investigation was concluded and that I'd done the right thing by cooperating." She paused. "And then he told me that Tomas and Jocelyn had also been cooperative, which I knew wasn't true because neither of them had given statements. And I think he wanted me to believe that so that I'd think the story was consistent. He was managing you." "Yes. And I let him, because it was easier." Another breath. 3 weeks ago, I heard through someone in medical records that the Okafor complaint had been reopened. I didn't know what that meant, not exactly, but I know what Okafor means to Harlan because I was charge nurse on that ward when Okafor came in." A pause. "I saw what happened that night, too." Lena's hand tightened around the phone. "The Okafor case. I was on shift. I watched Harlan delay the intervention. I watched the patient's pressure drop while Harlan stood at the nursing station and answered a call on his personal phone. I wrote it in my shift notes." A long exhale. "My shift notes from that date are no longer in the system. I checked last week. They've been purged." "When were they purged?" "The access log shows a deletion 18 months ago. I didn't notice because I had no reason to look." Her voice had steadied into something flat and factual, the voice of someone who had made a decision and was moving through it. "The person whose credentials were used for the deletion, it wasn't Harlan directly. It was Aldis." The name sat in the silence. Lena absorbed it. Rachel Aldis. Department head. Harlan's professional cover. The woman who had transferred Tomas Reyes and Jocelyn Park and called it staffing reallocation. The woman who had sat in the termination meeting and said nothing. "Aldis deleted your shift notes on the Okafor case," Lena said. "Yes." "And she's the one who sat you down with the statement for my case." "Yes." Paulette's voice was very quiet. "I think she's been cleaning up after him for years. I think the committee review that closed the Okafor complaint, she controlled the outcome of that. I think she's been doing it long enough that she doesn't see it as covering for him anymore. She sees it as protecting the department." "There's no distinction," Lena said. "I know that now." A pause. "I want to give a corrected statement. I want to tell the investigator what I actually saw. Both cases." Her voice was not steady, but it was certain. "I know what that means for me. I know I'll face consequences for the original statement. I'm prepared for that." Lena closed her eyes briefly. She thought about the woman who had texted her 6 weeks ago. I didn't have a choice. And the woman on the phone now. And the distance between them, which was smaller than it looked because fear was not the same as malice, and both were capable of the same damage. "Call Sylvie Oram tomorrow morning," she said. "Her number is—" "I already have it," Paulette said. "Someone left it in my mailbox at the hospital today." Lena went very still. "What?" "An envelope. No return address. Just a card with a name and number and the words 'when you're ready.'" A pause. "I assumed it was from you." "It wasn't from Lena." She looked at Adrienne's ceiling and thought about Wark, who had told her people waited until the door felt real before walking through it, and who had apparently decided to build the door in advance. "Call her," Lena said. "First thing." She told Wark about the envelope. He didn't confirm or deny it, which was confirmation. She didn't push because the result was Paulette Wade calling Sylvie Oram at 8:14 a.m. the following morning and spending 2 hours giving a recorded corrective statement that covered both the Fry incident and the Okafor case, and Rachel Aldis's deletion of nursing shift records. Oram called Lena at 11:30 a.m. "Wade's statement changes the architecture," she said, which was the most Oram ever came to showing excitement. "We now have direct testimony linking Aldis to the destruction of documentation in the Okafor case. That takes this from a single physician's misconduct into a coordinated pattern involving department leadership." A brief pause. "I'm filing an amended complaint with the health department this afternoon. The amended complaint names both Harlan and Aldis as respondents." "What does that do to the timeline?" "It complicates it. The health department will want to interview Aldis separately, which adds a step. But it also means Harlan can no longer rely on Aldis to run institutional interference for him. They'll have separate legal representation now because their interests have diverged." She paused again. "When two people who have been protecting each other are suddenly facing the same inquiry from opposing corners, they tend to make decisions that protect themselves." "They'll undercut each other," Lena said. "Historically, yes." Oram's voice was dry. "It's not a pleasant process to watch, but it's effective." Lena relayed this to Wark over the prepaid phone while Bruno watched her from his mat with the attentive patience of a dog that had decided she was worth monitoring. She had stopped finding his attention strange. She had started finding it grounding. "There's a board meeting at Ridgecrest Regional this Thursday," Wark said. "Emergency session. The hospital's general counsel called it." "About the investigation?" "About the investigation, the civil action from the Okafor family, and a third matter that came out yesterday." A pause. "A former patient filed a complaint through the state health department last week. Not Fry, not Okafor. A different patient from 14 months ago. Presenting complaint was chest pain and shortness of breath. Differential included aortic dissection. Harlan was the attending, and he discharged the patient after a shortened observation period." "What happened to the patient?" "He was readmitted 6 hours later through a different hospital. Confirmed type B dissection. He survived, but the delay in diagnosis is in his records." His voice was even. "The health department flagged it as a potentially related complaint when they saw Harlan's name on the investigation roster." 3 patients. 3 separate events, each managed into silence through different mechanisms. The Okafor family's complaint through a committee Harlan controlled. The dissection patient through a different facility that didn't know to look for a pattern. And Lena herself through the most thorough mechanism of all. Not just silence, but active reorientation of the record to make silence unnecessary because the story had already been rewritten. "He's been doing this for a long time," she said. "Yes," Wark said. "And the infrastructure for it, the committee access, the documentation privileges, the relationships with administration, none of that was built overnight. What you walked into on September 14th was a system that had been running for years." She sat with this for a moment. The specific and personal fury of it, being selected, being used, being written into someone else's cover story, had not gone away. But beneath it now was something larger and less personal, which was the understanding that she had not been uniquely targeted so much as she had been the next person in a sequence that had been running long enough to become routine, which made it worse, in a way, and also clarified what the outcome needed to look like. "The board meeting Thursday," she said. "Will they take action?" "Oram is attending as a representative of the investigation. She's going to present the evidence package to the board directly. The hospital's counsel has already advised the board that the legal exposure is significant." He paused. "Boards take action when the alternative is liability. They're at that point." "What kind of action?" "Harlan will be suspended pending the investigation at minimum. Aldis is likely to be placed on administrative leave. The board will commission an independent clinical review of all cases where either of them had primary responsibility over the past 5 years." He said it flatly. "That review will take months, but it will be thorough." She looked at her hands. I want to be there, she said. Thursday, at the board meeting. That's not advisable. You're a party to the investigation. I know I'm a party to the investigation. I'm not asking to testify. I'm asking to be in the building. She kept her voice steady. 6 weeks ago, I left through the service entrance of that hospital because I couldn't face the main lobby. I'm not asking for a dramatic moment. I just need to be there. There was a pause on the line. I'll arrange it, Wark said. Okay. The board meeting was held in a conference room on the 4th floor of Ridgecrest Regional Medical Center, and Lena arrived 20 minutes early and sat in the lobby near the main entrance and did not go anywhere else. She wore clean clothes and her hair pulled back, and she did not look like a woman who was waiting for something. She looked like someone who had already waited long enough. She saw Harlan come through the main entrance at 8:47 a.m. He was in his usual configuration, pressed shirt, good jacket, the particular erectness of a man accustomed to being the most relevant person in any room he entered. He was with a man she didn't recognize who carried a briefcase and walked like a lawyer. Harlan's eyes swept the lobby with the automatic survey of someone checking his environment. He saw her. She watched him see her. She watched the micro-adjustment happen, the slight change in stride that wasn't quite a stumble, the reorientation of his gaze to a point past her left shoulder, the deliberate non-acknowledgement of a man who had spent 3 months building a case around her absence and was now encountering her presence in the building where that case lived. She did not look away. She did not stand or speak or change her expression. She simply held the eye contact he was trying to refuse until he passed through the elevator doors. Wark appeared from the direction of the stairwell 2 minutes later. Bruno was not with him. "He's here," she said. "I know." Aldous arrived 10 minutes ago through the parking structure entrance. He sat down in the chair beside her, not across from her, shoulder to shoulder. "Orem is already in the conference room. The board chair has the evidence package. How long will it take?" "The meeting is scheduled for 2 hours. It may run longer." He looked at the elevator bank. "How are you doing?" She had given him a better answer than fine the last time he'd asked. She tried for accurate again. "I feel like I've been carrying something heavy for a long time," she said, "and it's not gone yet, but I can see the place where I'm going to put it down." Wark nodded once. That was all. She waited. She was good at waiting, better than most people because she had been trained to use it, to keep her hands still and her breathing regulated and her focus on the information the present moment contained rather than the 10 futures she could imagine. So she sat in the lobby of the hospital that had fired her and watched the elevator numbers and the front desk and the orderlies crossing the atrium with their equipment carts and the whole ordinary persistent life of a place that had tried to reduce her to a warning in someone else's file. At 10:23 a.m., Orem texted her. Harlan's counsel requested a recess. Board denied it. Proceeding. At 10:51 a.m., Aldis's attorney asked to speak separately from Harlan's. Board granted it. They're separating them now. At 11:34 a.m., Orem walked out of the elevator. Her expression was professionally neutral in a way that Lena had learned to read as controlled satisfaction. The board voted to suspend Dr. Harlan's clinical privileges effective immediately, pending the outcome of the health department investigation, she said, sitting down. Dr. Aldis has been placed on administrative leave. The board is commissioning an independent review of all patient cases under Harlan's primary care for the past 6 years. Lena exhaled. The nursing board stay has been granted as of this morning, Orem continued. Your license suspension is paused. The countercomplaint Harlan filed has been referred back to the health department investigation. She paused. Reinstatement will follow formal completion of the investigation, which I estimate at 4 to 6 weeks. But practically, you are cleared to seek employment. The suspension is lifted. Lena looked at the atrium. A patient was being moved through it in a wheelchair, accompanied by someone who might have been his daughter, and the small ordinariness of it, a person being helped from one place to another, was almost too much to look at directly. The Okafor family's civil action, she said, is now significantly stronger. Their attorney has been briefed on the board's findings and the additional patient complaint. The hospital's exposure on the civil matter is, Orem chose her word carefully, considerable. And the criminal referral? The health department is forwarding the case to the DA's office by end of week. The specific charges they're recommending are falsification of medical records, obstruction of a clinical investigation, and reckless endangerment of patient welfare. Orem folded her hands. Whether the DA pursues it is outside my influence, but they've been given a package that's unusually complete. Clean charges, specific, named, not professional concerns or systemic issues or any of the softening language that administrative processes used when they wanted to move things without creating enemies. She thought about Paulette Wade, who would face consequences for the original statement and had made the call anyway. She thought about Jocelyn Park, who had answered a late-night call without knowing whether answering it would protect her or expose her. She thought about Nora Vasquez, who had left a hospital she'd worked at for 6 years, and whose departure nobody had connected to the access log on a date that now sat at the center of everything. She thought about Tomas Reyes, who had looked over his shoulder in a parking lot and walked away and then called a lawyer's office when the door finally looked real. What happens to them, she asked. Park, Reyes, Wade. They cooperated with the investigation. Nursing Board is unlikely to pursue action against witnesses who came forward voluntarily and corrected earlier statements, Orem said, particularly in the context of documented coercion. Wade will likely face a formal inquiry, but given her circumstances and the corrective statement, it's unlikely to result in license action. A brief pause. Unlikely is not impossible, but it's unlikely. It was the same math as her own 90%, the residual 10, life in the space where unlikely lived. Thank you, Lena said. She said it to Orem and meant it specifically, and without decoration. Orem looked at her for a moment with the expression of a woman who worked in a field that occasionally reminded her why she had chosen it. Don't thank me yet, she said. The DA still has to file. I know, but thank you anyway. Orem left. Work remained. They sat in the lobby of Ridgecrest Regional Medical Center while the building moved around them. Patients and staff, and the infrastructure of a place that had continued to function through everything that had happened within it. And Lena thought about what it felt like to be in a room where she had been named as a threat and now was simply a person sitting in a chair. Bruno is in the truck, Wark said after a while. I figured. He knows something is different. He was restless this morning. He glanced at her. He does that when he's been working toward something and it shifts. She looked at him. How long did you know something was wrong? Before the pawn shop? Before you saw the medal? Wark was quiet for a moment. I didn't know specifically, but I've spent 30 years in medical command environments, and I have a particular, intolerance is the wrong word, sensitivity to the kind of institutional behavior where one person's record is used to protect another person's record. He looked at the elevator. I've seen it done to junior officers. I've seen it done to civilians. I've seen it done with far more sophisticated tools than a modified incident report. His voice was flat. It always looks the same. Someone with access and someone without access, and the person with access decides what the record says. And then the record is the truth, she said, until it isn't. She thought about the bronze star in Wark's jacket pocket. Still there, she assumed, because he hadn't mentioned returning it and she hadn't asked. She thought about the moment she had put it on the pawn shop counter, what that had meant, what she had been letting go of. Not the medal. The belief that the things she had done could be made not to have happened. The belief that what was true could be permanently replaced by what was written. It hadn't been. She was still sitting with this when her phone, the prepaid phone, buzzed with a message from a number she didn't recognize. She opened it. The message contained a photograph, a screenshot, specifically, of an internal Ridgecrest email chain dated that morning between Harlan's personal email address and a hospital administrator whose name she didn't know. The chain was short, 2 messages. The first from Harlan, sent at 7:44 a.m. before the board meeting. If this goes the way I think it will, we need the Vasquez deposition discredited. She was terminated for cause. Get the file to my attorney by noon. The second, from the administrator, sent at 7:58 a.m. Already done. Sent last night. Lena read it twice. Nora Vasquez, the surgical tech who had placed Harlan at the records terminal on October 3rd, whose deposition existed independently of everything Harlan could contest, had been listed as terminated for cause. Not resigned, terminated. Her deposition's credibility rested in part on the circumstances of her departure. A witness who left voluntarily because she saw something wrong was one thing. A witness who was fired for cause was another. A defense attorney could use that to suggest motive, animus, a disgruntled former employee with a reason to fabricate. Lena showed the phone to Wark. He read it. He looked up. The termination record, she said. If it was backdated or manufactured, then Vasquez's actual departure circumstances, whatever was documented at the time, will contradict it, he said. Payroll records, exit interview, HR files. Those can't be changed retroactively without leaving a trail. He looked at the phone. Who sent this? She turned the phone over. The number was not in her contacts. It was a Colorado Springs area code. I don't know, she said. Wark took out his own phone and dialed. He waited. Someone answered and he said simply, "Did you send a photograph to the number I gave you?" A pause. Then, "Thank you." He hung up. "Sousa," he said. "He's been monitoring Harlan's accessible email traffic since the preservation order went through. Anything that touches the case." That's... She stopped. "Is that legal?" "The preservation order covers all case-related communications. If Harlan sent that email through a server the order applies to, it's in scope." He pocketed his phone. "Arguably." "Arguably," she repeated. "Orem will know what to do with it." He stood. "Call her." Lena called. Orem picked up on the second ring, and Lena read her the email chain, and there was a silence on the line that lasted long enough to mean something substantive. "Forward it to me," Orem said. "Right now." What does it mean for Vasquez? It means Harlan just attempted to tamper with the deponent in an active civil matter while under a health department investigation. Orem's voice had the quality of someone doing math rapidly. That's not administrative. That's criminal obstruction. That's a separate charge from everything else, committed this morning, documented by his own hand. A pause. "Forward the photograph." Lena forwarded it. She looked at Wark. He was looking at the elevator bank with the expression of a man watching something complete itself. "The DA," she said. "This changes the timeline." "This changes more than the timeline," Wark said. "A man who manipulates records before the board meeting to protect himself from an investigation is managing a problem. A man who attempts to discredit a deponent the morning of the board meeting while that meeting is in session is panicking." He looked at her. Harlan just handed the DA's office a clean criminal act with a timestamp. She absorbed this. It had not been clean. Nothing about any of it had been clean. Not the evidence recovery, not the legal maneuvering, not Paulette Wade's fractured voice on the phone at midnight, not Tomas Reyes calling a lawyer's office from whatever borrowed courage he'd scraped together, not the 4 hours in Sousa's office watching a corrupted drive give up its fragments, not the night in the library reference section counting seconds while a blue car with a cracked taillight tracked her through Denton. But the outcome was assembling itself from all of those imperfect pieces, and it was beginning to look like something real. She was still looking at the elevator bank when the doors opened and Victor Harlan walked out. He was with his attorney. His face had the contained, tight quality of someone who had just spent 2 hours in a room where things had not gone the way he planned, and his posture was still controlled, but she could see. She had always been able to see. It had been the thing that made her dangerous to him. She could see the tells. The jaw slightly forward, the hand not quite relaxed at his side. He saw her again. This time he couldn't look away fast enough, and this time she stood up. She didn't say anything. She didn't move toward him. She simply stood in the lobby of the hospital where he had tried to erase her and let him look at the fact that she was still there, and that she was standing, and that he was the one walking toward the exit. His attorney touched his arm and said something low, and Harlan looked away and moved toward the door, and she watched him go with the same steadiness with which she had held every difficult thing for the past 6 weeks. But as the doors closed behind him and his attorney, she saw the attorney reach into his jacket pocket and produce a phone, and she watched the attorney's face as he read whatever was on the screen, and she watched the attorney stop walking and turn back to look at Harlan with an expression that had nothing in it of professional composure. Harlan had not yet seen the expression. He was already through the door. The attorney pulled him back inside, and Lena understood. Watching the attorney's face, watching the specific quality of what he was showing Harlan on that phone screen, that the email chain had not stayed in Orum's inbox alone. The DA's office had already been copied. Harlan's attorney pulled him back through the lobby doors with the specific urgency of a man who understood that the next 30 seconds of his client's behavior would matter more than the previous 2 hours of board proceedings. Lena watched from across the atrium. She could not hear what the attorney was saying. She didn't need to. The body language was a complete sentence. The attorney's hand on Harlan's arm, the lowered voice, the phone held between them at an angle that forced Harlan to look at the screen rather than at the room around him. And Harlan's face as he read it. The color draining from it in a way that had nothing performative about it, nothing controlled, just the raw physiological response of a man whose nervous system had received information it had not been prepared for. He looked up from the phone. He looked at Lena. She held it. She did not look away, and she did not move, and she did not give him the satisfaction of an expression that told him anything about what she was feeling, because what she was feeling was complicated and private and not his to read. The attorney spoke again. Harlan looked back at the phone. Then he let himself be steered toward the building's side corridor, away from the main exit, away from the lobby, and the doors closed behind them. Wark appeared at her shoulder. DA's office confirmed receipt, he said. They're fast-tracking the obstruction charge. It'll be filed separately from the health department referral, which means 2 separate criminal tracks. His attorney knows, she said. His attorney is currently calculating whether to advise cooperation or defense, which means Harlan is about to have a very expensive and uncomfortable afternoon. He said it without satisfaction, but with the clean factual completeness of someone closing a loop. Orum wants you in her office at 2 o'clock. For what? Your formal statement on the reinstatement, and to sign off on the corrected record. A pause. It's paperwork, but it's the paperwork that puts your name back where it belongs. She nodded. She took one more look at the corridor where Harlan had disappeared, and then she turned away from it because she had always known that watching a person fall apart was not the same as being whole yourself, and she had never wanted the two things confused. Orum's office was on the 7th floor of a building 6 blocks from Ridgecrest, and it smelled like printer toner and the particular variety of coffee that people drank when they were going to be working past 8 p.m. Wark brought Bruno, who investigated the office with professional interest and then settled beside Lena's chair with his flank against her ankle in what had become, over the past week, his default position relative to her. The paperwork took 90 minutes. It was not dramatic. It was forms and signatures, and Orum explaining each document in the flat, precise language of someone who respected other people's time too much to editorialize. The reinstatement request, the corrected nursing board record, removing the suspension notation, the formal response to Harlan's countercomplaint, which was now moot but which required official dismissal nonetheless, the chain of custody documentation for the drive and the notebook, which would be entered into the health department's evidence file. At one point, Orum put a document in front of her and said, "This is the formal finding from the board's independent review panel. It's preliminary. The full review takes months, but they've issued an interim finding on the Fry incident specifically." Lena read it. The language was institutional and careful, the language of people trained to say necessary things without unnecessary heat. But what it said in that careful language was this, that on the night of September 14th, Nurse Lena Marsh had responded appropriately to a deteriorating patient's clinical presentation, that her administration of vasopressor support was consistent with established standards of care, and that the subsequent documentation of that event did not accurately reflect the sequence or context of the clinical decisions made. It did not say she was right and he was wrong. It did not say she was set up. It said what institutional documents said, which was the minimum true thing in the maximum careful phrasing, and it was enough. She put the document down. "Sign at the bottom," Orum said. She signed. Victor Harlan was formally charged by the Denton County District Attorney's Office 11 days later. The charges were filed on a Wednesday morning, and by Wednesday afternoon they had been reported by the local news desk of the Denton Register, which ran a brief item under the headline, "Ridgecrest Surgeon Faces Criminal Charges in Records Falsification Case." The item was picked up by the state wire and expanded. By Thursday, it had been picked up by 3 national medical industry publications, which ran longer versions that included the health department's findings, the board's suspension of clinical privileges, and the connection to the Okafor civil action. The specific charges: falsification of medical records, obstruction of a clinical investigation, and criminal tampering with a deponent in an active civil proceeding. The last charge, the one that had come from the email chain Souza had captured on a Wednesday morning, while Harlan sat in a board meeting believing he was still managing the situation, carried the highest exposure. Rachel Aldis was charged separately, 4 days after Harlan, with destruction of medical records and obstruction of an internal investigation. Her attorney issued a statement indicating she intended to cooperate with prosecutors. Harlan's attorney issued no statement. The Okafor family's civil suit was refiled with the amended evidence and a request for expedited hearing, which the court granted. Lena learned most of this from Orem in the same flat informational register in which Orem communicated everything, and she received it the same way, processing each piece as it arrived, not accumulating it into triumph, just letting it be what it was. True. Documented. In the record now in a way that couldn't be reached and adjusted at 2:31 in the morning. She was staying at Adrienne's house still because her studio apartment had begun to feel like a place she had survived in rather than lived in, and she wasn't ready to go back to it yet. Adrienne had not made any comment about the length of the stay and had instead started leaving coffee made in the mornings, which was its own language. Bruno was there most days. Work brought him in the mornings and collected him in the evenings, an arrangement that had established itself without formal discussion and that Bruno had apparently approved of, because he moved between Work's truck and Adrienne's kitchen with the settled ease of an animal who had decided both locations were safe. On the day the Harlan charges were filed, Lena sat at Adrienne's kitchen table with Bruno beside her and her notebook open in front of her, not writing in it but looking at it. The pages from September 14th, the times she had written in a parking lot with a flashlight because her hands needed something to do. 11:36, map 54, patient stable but declining. 11:38, verbal notification to Dr. H, pressor need. Response, hold. 11:42, map 43, patient diaphoretic, skin modeling beginning at periphery. 11:47, second verbal notification. Response, watch him. 11:49, administered norepinephrine. 0.1 micrograms per kilogram per minute per clinical judgment. 11:53, yet MAPI recovering, 58 and climbing. She had written these things in the dark in a parking lot because she had learned years earlier in conditions considerably worse than a hospital parking lot that the only protection against a reality that could be revised was a record made in the moment by the person who was there. She had not known she was going to need it. She had done it anyway. That was the thing she kept coming back to. Not the investigation, not the charges, not the board meeting or the DA's filing or any of the machinery that had ground its way through the past weeks. The notebook, written before any of it, in the parking lot, in the dark, because it was what she had been trained to do and she had done it without knowing it would matter. Paulette Wade had said I didn't have a choice and meant it as an explanation for giving a statement that was technically true and functionally dishonest. Lena had written times and MAP readings in a notebook and meant nothing by it except documentation. The difference between them had not been virtue. It had been habit. And the habit had come from 2 tours in an environment that had no patience for the gap between what happened and what was recorded. She closed the notebook. Bruno put his chin on her knee. I know, she said, to no one and to him simultaneously. Athais. The nursing board's formal reinstatement letter arrived on a Friday, which was 3 weeks and 4 days after the board meeting at Ridgecrest. It was a single page on official letterhead, and it stated in language that was exhaustively bureaucratic and briefly unambiguous that the suspension of Lena Marsh's registered nursing license had been lifted, that the complaint filed on September 17th had been dismissed with prejudice, and that the counter-complaint filed subsequently had been determined to be without merit and removed from her professional record. She read it at Adrienne's kitchen table. She read it twice. Then she folded it along its original creases and put it in the notebook between the September 14th entries and the blank pages that followed them. Adrienne, who had been making eggs at the stove and clearly watching her peripheral vision, said, "Good news?" "Yeah," Lena said. "Good news." Adrienne turned back to the stove. "Eggs?" "Yes." They ate breakfast without ceremony, which was exactly right. Well, Wark came by that afternoon with Bruno and a folder he put on the kitchen table with the same lack of preamble with which he did everything. "I want to show you something," he said. The folder contained a proposal document. She picked it up and read the title. Transition to Civilian Emergency Medicine, a training framework for former military medical personnel. Below it, a subtitle, Pilot Program Proposal, Denton 5, a medical center in partnership with the Colorado State Nursing Association. She looked up at him. "It's not finalized," he said. "It needs a director, someone who understands both environments, military medical training and civilian trauma care, well enough to build curriculum that actually transfers." He sat down. "The gap between those two worlds is wider than it should be. Former medics and corpsmen and flight nurses come out of service with more practical experience than most civilian nurses have after 5 years. And they spend their first year in a civilian hospital being treated like they know nothing because their credentials don't translate directly." "I know," she said. "I lived that." "Yes, which is why I think you understand what the program needs to do." He folded his hands on the table. "I'm not offering this as a consolation. I'm offering it because it's the right job for the right person, and the right person is sitting in front of me." She looked at the proposal. 12 pages. She could tell from the structure that it had been in development for longer than the past few weeks. This was not something he had constructed for her. This was something he had been building and had been waiting to find the right person to carry. "It would mean working with the VA," she said, "primarily, with some clinical hours at partner facilities to maintain your practical currency. And the curriculum development would be yours," he said, "with input from the advisory committee, but the structure and content are the director's domain." She was quiet for a moment. Bruno had moved to her side of the table, which seemed to be his habitual vote. "I need to go back to clinical work first," she said. "I can't build a training program for trauma nurses if I've been out of a trauma bay for 4 months. I'll lose the authority to teach it." Wark nodded. "The program doesn't launch for 6 months. That's enough time to work a rotation somewhere and remember what your hands know." "And you'd be involved?" "I'd be on the advisory committee. I'm not your supervisor." He said it like it was obvious. "You don't need one." She looked at him for a long moment. This man who had walked into a pawn shop with a retired war dog and recognized a medal and asked the right question at the right time, and who had then done the unglamorous, meticulous work of making the right answer possible. He was not a simple man. He was not a soft one. He had his own history of things done and not done, of institutional spaces navigated and occasionally battered against, of the particular weariness of someone who had spent a long time in systems that were imperfect and had chosen to stay in them anyway because leaving didn't fix them. She understood him better now than she had a week ago. She thought she'd probably understand him better still in 6 months, if the proposal on the table became what he was proposing it could become. "I need to think about it," she said. "I know," he said. "I brought it today so you'd have time." But she thought about it for 5 days. She spent those 5 days doing what Wark had suggested, getting her hands back into clinical work. She called Adrienne, who called a contact at Denton EMS, and by the 3rd day she was writing shifts as a paramedic support on the ambulance rotation, not as a nurse, just as an extra set of trained hands in a crude environment where the work was real and the stakes were real, and there was no time to think about anything except the patient and the protocol and the next decision. It was not the same as a trauma bay. It was louder and more chaotic, and the equipment was mounted differently and the lighting was worse. But the core of it was the same. A person in front of you who needed something, and the question of what that something was, and the answer you found or didn't find in the time you had. On the 3rd shift, they ran a call to an apartment building where a 60-year-old man had collapsed in his kitchen. He was conscious when they arrived, but his pressure was low and dropping, and his skin had the gray undertone that Lena had learned to read faster than most instruments. She worked his IV while the paramedic drove, and she watched his MAP on the portable monitor, and she thought about a number, 43. And the memory of it was not traumatic, not in the way she had expected. It was clarifying. It told her exactly what this patient needed and how fast he needed it, and she did what the memory told her to do. And by the time they reached the ER, his pressure was climbing. The ER nurse who received him glanced at Lena's work and said, "Nice line placement." "Thanks," Lena said. She was back in the ambulance before the nurse could ask who she was. On the 5th day, she called Wark. "I'll do it," she said. A pause. "Not surprised, am I?" She suspected he had not been surprised by many things in his life, but something that had the quality of quiet completion. "Good," he said. "Come to the VA office Monday. We'll start the formal proposal process." "I need to go back to my apartment first," she said. "I've been at Adrienne's for almost a month." "I know. And I need to find a clinical placement for the next 6 months, somewhere with a real trauma volume. I have 3 facilities in mind. We'll discuss them Monday." She smiled. Not widely, not fully. She was still a person with 4 months of damage that hadn't finished resolving, who still woke up some nights in the gray pre-dawn space between sleep and full consciousness and had to spend a moment reassembling herself. But the smile was real. It came from the place in her chest that had been locked since September and was beginning slowly and without fanfare to open. "Wark," she said. "Yes." "The medal. You still have it." A pause. "I do. I'd like it back." Another pause, this one different. "I'll bring it Monday," he said. She returned to her apartment on a Saturday afternoon in late November when the light was thin and the temperature had dropped enough that her breath showed in front of her. The apartment was exactly as she had left it, which she had known intellectually, but which still required a moment of adjustment. The folding table, the stack of legal letters, the cardboard box near the door. She picked up the box. She went through it with the systematic attention she brought to any inventory. The photo of her unit, the spare scrubs, the first aid kit. She put the scrubs in the laundry. She put the first aid kit on the shelf where it belonged. She put the photo on the folding table where she could see it. Then she sat on her bed and called her cousin in Wyoming, who picked up on the second ring and said, "I was starting to think you'd disappeared." And Lena said, "I almost did." And her cousin said, "But you didn't." And Lena said, "No, I didn't." They talked for 40 minutes, which was longer than they had talked in years. And it was not a smooth conversation. It had gaps and dead ends and moments where Lena didn't know how to explain something and just left it unexplained. But it was real. And when they hung up, she felt the specific lightness of a person who had let someone see them. She was not fixed. She wanted to be clear about that, even just to herself. 4 months of having her record dismantled and her colleagues silenced and her professional identity stripped down and sold for the price of someone else's convenience did not resolve in 6 weeks of legal proceedings, however thorough. She still had moments of cold, sideways anger that came at unpredictable times. She still had the 3 a.m. ceiling. She still had the specific loneliness of a person who had been through something that most people around her could understand only in outline, not in texture. But she had also learned something that she hadn't had the language for in the parking lot outside Ridgecrest on the night she carried her box out through the service entrance. The story of what happened to you is not the same thing as the record of what you did. Harlan had spent years understanding this in one direction, that controlling the record meant controlling the story, that if you shaped what was written down, you could reshape what was understood to have happened. He had been right about the mechanism. He had been wrong about its permanence. Records could be modified, but they left traces. Documentation could be deleted, but the deletion itself was data. And the people who were in the room when something happened carried what they saw in a way that no modification could reach. And eventually, given enough pressure and enough time and enough of a reason to believe the door was real, they walked through it. She had been a witness to her own story. She had written it down at 11:36 p.m. and 11:38 and 11:42 and 11:47 and 11:49. She had written it before she knew it needed to be written, out of a habit she had built in the worst possible conditions for the most practical of reasons. And when the version of the story that someone else had written tried to replace hers, the dates and the times and the map readings were still there in a notebook in a cardboard box, waiting with the patience of things that are simply true. On Monday, she went to the VA office. Wark was at his desk with 2 folders and a legal pad, and Bruno on his mat in the corner, and on the edge of the desk, set apart from the folders, was the bronze star with valor in its small hinged box. She picked it up. She held it for a moment. It was heavier than she remembered, which might have been the weight of what she'd been through since the last time she held it, or might have been that she hadn't been in a position to feel the weight of things for a while and was now. "Thank you," she said. She meant it to cover more than the metal. Wark looked at her with his gray eyes and said, "Don't thank me. You did the work. You showed up in a pawn shop." "Bruno showed up in a pawn shop," he said. "I was just holding the leash." Bruno's tail moved twice. He did not open his eyes. She put the metal in her jacket pocket and sat down, and they began to work. The criminal proceedings moved on the timeline that criminal proceedings moved on, which was slower than anyone wanted and faster than some people feared. Victor Harlan entered a not guilty plea in January, which his attorney had advised and which the DA's office had anticipated. The trial date was set for the following September, which meant there would be months of pretrial process and discovery and motion practice that Orem kept Lena informed of in the same flat periodic updates she had always used. Rachel Aldis entered a guilty plea in February on the record's destruction charge. Her cooperation agreement required her testimony in the Harlan proceedings, which her attorney had negotiated as a condition of the reduced charge. She resigned from Ridgecrest Regional Medical Center. The day the plea was entered, the press release from the hospital described her departure as a mutual decision, which Lena read and set aside because the press release was the hospital managing its story and not her concern. The independent clinical review of Harlan's cases over the preceding 6 years was completed in March and identified 11 cases where documentation was inconsistent with clinical indicators in ways that warranted further review. 3 of those cases were referred to the DA's office as potential additional charges. The review's findings were reported by the same medical industry publications that had covered the initial charges, and this time the coverage was longer and the tone was different. Not just a local story about a surgeon in Colorado, but a piece about what it looked like when a single practitioner accumulated enough institutional protection to run unexamined for the better part of a decade. The Okafor family settled their civil action in April. The terms were confidential, as civil settlements were, but the family's attorney issued a statement that said the family was grateful that the full truth of Gerald Okafor's care had been documented and that they hoped the outcome would contribute to safer practices at the institution going forward. Lena read the statement and thought about a 62-year-old man who had come in from a vehicle accident and had not deserved what the subsequent hours delivered, and she thought about the family who had filed a complaint and been managed back into silence by a committee review that was designed to absorb complaints rather than resolve them. The settlement did not give them back what they had lost. It gave them something else, acknowledgement, and the documented fact that what had happened, and that the record now said so. Paulette Wade faced a nursing board inquiry in the spring. The inquiry lasted 3 sessions and resulted in a formal reprimand and a 1-year period of supervised practice, which was on the lenient end of possible outcomes and reflected the board's assessment that her original statement had been given under documented pressure and corrected voluntarily before the investigation concluded. She remained at Ridgecrest, which surprised Lena when she heard it. She thought about calling to say something, and then she thought about what she would say, and she decided there wasn't anything that needed to be said. Paulette Wade had made a choice that had cost Lena 4 months, and had then made a different choice that had helped return what those 4 months had taken. Both of those things were true simultaneously. Living with both was part of the work. Tomas Reyes and Jocelyn Park both gave depositions in the pretrial proceedings. Lena did not speak to either of them during this period because the legal process required careful separation of witnesses. She heard through Orem that both had done well, clear, specific, consistent with the documented timeline. People who had waited and then not waited when the moment arrived. Nora Vasquez's deposition survived the challenge to her credibility. The hospital's attempt to reclassify her departure as a termination for cause was refuted by her original HR file, her exit interview documentation, and 3 payroll records that contradicted the retroactive classification. The attempt itself became an additional piece of the obstruction case against Harlan, because the email chain showing his direction of the effort had been filed as evidence before his attorney could argue it was protected communication. He had sent it from his personal account through the hospital server on the morning of the board meeting. It had been captured by the preservation order he had not known was broad enough to include personal email accounts accessed through institutional infrastructure. He had built a trap. He had walked into it himself, and he had done it in writing at 7:44 in the morning, while the case he was trying to obstruct was being presented 3 floors above him. Lena thought about this sometimes. Not with satisfaction, exactly. Satisfaction implied the wrong thing, implied that his ruin was the point, and it hadn't been the point. The point had been her nursing license. The point had been the record of what she had done on September 14th, reflecting what she had actually done on September 14th. The point had been Donald Fry's chart showing that he had been cared for correctly by a nurse who had made the right call and waited 11 minutes to make it, and then made it when she had to. His ruin was a consequence. It was correct, and it was appropriate, and she would not perform regret about it. But it was not the point. The point was the notebook. The point was the 11-minute window. The point was that she had been in that room, and she had done her job, and she had known what she knew. The training program launched in October. Not with ceremony, because Wark was not a ceremony person, and Lena was not a ceremony person. And between the two of them, they had designed a launch that consisted of 11 former military medics and corpsmen, and 1 former flight nurse sitting in a conference room at the Denton 5 Medical Center with a curriculum binder and a schedule, and Lena at the front of the room with a whiteboard and her notebook in her jacket pocket for reasons she couldn't have fully explained. She looked at them. 11 people who had been in the kinds of conditions she had been in, who had made decisions with their hands and their training in situations that did not allow for hesitation, and who were now trying to navigate a civilian medical system that did not know how to read them. "I'm not going to tell you that this transition is going to be easy," she said. "I'm going to tell you that the skills you have are real, and they are substantial, and they will be questioned by people who have never seen what you've seen. And that questioning is going to feel like an insult because it is one." She paused. "But the answer to an insult is not to leave. The answer is to stay and be so undeniably right about the patient in front of you that the room has no choice but to adjust its assessment of what you're capable of." A woman in the second row, former Army flight medic, 2 tours, her record said, looked at her with the specific expression of someone who had heard variations of this speech before and was waiting to see if this one was different. "I know how it sounds," Lena said. "I know it sounds like something someone says because it's the thing to say." She put her hands on the table in front of her. "I had my license suspended 7 months ago because a surgeon with 11 years of institutional access decided I was more useful as a scapegoat than as a nurse. I got it back. I'm standing here." She looked at the former flight medic. "The staying is the hardest part. I'm not going to tell you otherwise, but it's the part that matters." The room was quiet in a way that felt like attention rather than silence. "So," she said, "let's talk about what happens in the first 90 days. Bruno died in December. It was not sudden. Wark had known for 2 months that the hip was worse and that something else was progressing in his lymph nodes, and he had spent those 2 months in the way you spent time with a dog you loved, which was doing ordinary things with the knowledge of their weight. He died at home, in the morning, with Wark beside him, which was the best version of the thing that was going to happen. Wark told Lena by phone. His voice was the same as it always was, controlled and factual, except for a quality at the edges of it that she had not heard before. She did not try to say the right thing because there was no right thing. She said, "I'll come over." She went. They sat in his living room with coffee and did not say very much, and at one point she put her hand on his forearm, not as comfort exactly, just as presence, and he looked at it and then out the window and did not say anything, and she did not require him to. She had spent an evening 4 months earlier in a library reference section counting the seconds between a German shepherd's alert and the moment it eased. She had spent a night in a diner booth with his weight against her foot. She had spent 7 months watching him read a room with those steady brown eyes and make assessments that people with thumbs and language and decades of training would have been proud of. He had found what everyone else had missed, not because he was exceptional in the way people meant when they said that word, but because he had been trained to look, and he had looked, and what he found when he looked was the thing that was true. She thought about this on the drive home. She thought about it in the way she had been thinking about most things recently. Not compulsively, not with the raw edge of the previous months, but with the considered attention of someone sorting through what an experience had left her. She had not chosen to be the person Harlan selected. She had not chosen to be fired, or to spend 4 months in a studio apartment with a shut-off notice on the electricity, or to stand at a pawn shop counter holding a medal that had cost her real things. She had not chosen any of the conditions that had made the next part of her life necessary. But she had chosen the notebook. She had chosen the 11-minute wait. She had chosen, in the parking lot on the worst night of her professional life, to write down what she had seen before she drove home, because her training had made documentation a reflex, and her character had made honesty a requirement, and neither of those things belonged to the conditions she was in. They belonged to her. That was the thing about what had happened. It had tried to use her own record against her, her presence in the trauma bay, her presence at the medication cart, her fingerprints on a decision that Harlan had reframed. It had tried to take the evidence of what she had done and make it into evidence of what she had done wrong. And it had almost worked. It had worked for 4 months, which was 4 months too long, and which she would not minimize or reframe into a lesson with clean edges, because it wasn't one. It was 4 months of her life that a man with access and a plan had taken, and there was no interpretation of that which made it acceptable. But it had not worked permanently. And the reason it had not worked permanently was not complicated. She had been there. She had seen what happened. And she had written it down. The rest, the general with his retired dog, the forensic technician and his recovered drive, the attorney who filed the subpoena in a single afternoon, the charge nurse who made a phone call at midnight, and a paramedic supervisor who left her porch light on. All of that was the structure that had made the truth visible. But the truth itself had been in the notebook all along, waiting in the handwriting of someone who had known, without knowing she would need to know, what had actually happened. She parked outside her apartment building. The night was cold and clear, and the stars were the way they got in Colorado in December, very close and very sharp. She sat in the car for a moment. Her license was in her wallet. Her program was running. Her notebook was in her jacket pocket, and the medal was on the wall above her desk, the first place she had put it when she moved back into the apartment, because the wall was where it belonged, and she was done with treating it as a relic of something finished. It was not a relic of something finished. It was a record of something she had done, which was different, which was the whole difference. She went inside. The ceiling was the same water-stained ceiling she had stared at during those first 6 weeks, and she looked at it for a moment. Not with the weight of those weeks, just with the acknowledgement of them. And then she turned off the light and went to sleep. And she did not wake up at 3 in the morning, and in the morning she made coffee and went to work. Because that was what you did when you had been through something that tried to tell you that you were not who you knew you were. You stayed, you documented. You waited 11 minutes when 11 minutes was what it took. And when the door finally opened, you walked through it and you kept walking. Not because the walking was easy, but because you were the one who knew what had happened in that room, and that knowledge was yours. And no modification at 2:31 in the morning could reach it. You had been there. That was enough. That had always been enough.